Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Paranormal M. Please subscribe if you haven't already. A few people have also told me that these stories help them fall asleep, so maybe give them a try at bedtime and share them with a friend who has trouble sleeping. Tonight's first story comes from Jason. He grew up on a remote farm and was completely comfortable being outside after dark. But one September night, his dad suddenly told him to stay inside. Later that night, Jason looked out the window and saw a figure standing in the field. Let's begin, and I hope you sleep well. I don't tell this story very often. My wife knows pieces of it, and a couple of people I grew up with know that something happened. But I've never really sat down and told anyone the whole thing. Not even my father, and he was there when it happened. My name is Jacob, and I grew up on a small corn and soybean farm outside Mason City, Iowa. It was the kind of place where the roads went dark after sunset, and the nearest neighbor lived a few miles away. My mother passed away when I was 13. After that, it was just my dad and me in the old farmhouse. He worked from sunrise until well after dark, especially during harvest season. I went to school, helped where I could, and rode my bike home from football practice most evenings. Being outside alone at night never frightened me. I'd traveled those country roads in complete darkness more times than I could count. The crickets, the wind moving through the crops, the occasional cry of a coyote, those sounds were simply part of home. Then, one evening in early October, my father told me not to go outside. I had just come home from practice. When I walked into the kitchen, he was standing beside the sink, staring through the window toward the fields. He didn't even turn around when he spoke. "Stay inside tonight, Jake." I laughed a little and asked him what he meant. He finally looked at me and said, "Don't go to the barn. Don't go looking for your bike. Don't step off the porch. Just stay inside." There was something in his voice I had never heard before. My father wasn't easily frightened. He had faced tornadoes, machinery accidents, injured livestock, and the loss of my mother without ever appearing shaken. But that night, his face looked pale and tired. I asked him what was wrong. He only said, "Promise me." So I promised. Later, sometime close to midnight, I woke up thirsty. On my way downstairs, I stopped beside the window at the end of the hallway. From there, I could see the fields behind the house. We had several old floodlights mounted on wooden poles. They cast dull amber circles across the property, leaving wide stretches of darkness between them. And in one of those circles, far beyond the barn, someone was standing among the crops. At first I thought it was a scarecrow. Then it moved. The figure slowly raised one arm and motioned toward the house. Toward me. It wasn't waving hello. It was curling its hand inward, asking me to come closer. I remember pressing my face against the glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure looked tall, though distance can play tricks at night. Its clothing appeared dark and stained, almost reddish beneath the amber light. I told myself it might be a hunter. Maybe someone had gotten lost. Maybe there had been an accident on the road. That was how I justified breaking my promise. I slipped on my shoes and quietly left through the side door. The air was unusually warm. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and every step carried me deeper into the smell of wet soil and dying leaves. For the first 100 yards, I felt foolish rather than afraid. Then I passed the grain shed. The house lights grew smaller behind me, and the sounds in the field began to change. When you stand outside a crop field, the wind sounds gentle. But once you walk between the rows, every stalk brushes against another. Every gust sounds like footsteps moving beside you. I kept hearing something rustle to my left, then to my right, then behind me. I told myself it was rabbits. I still prefer to believe that. The ground dipped, and I lost sight of the figure. When I reached the top of the slope again, it was gone. I should have turned back. Instead, I kept walking until I reached the place where it had been standing. The crops there had been flattened into a nearly perfect circle. The stalks weren't crushed the way they would have been by an animal or a tractor. They were bent carefully, almost individually, as though someone had pressed them down by hand. In the center of the circle was a stone. It was smooth, dark red, and polished like something taken from a riverbed. But there wasn't a river anywhere near our farm. I stared at it for what felt like several minutes. My thoughts became slow and distant. The fear drained out of me, even though I knew I should have been terrified. I began to reach for the stone. That was when a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, and my father was standing behind me with a flashlight. The moment the beam crossed my face, it felt as though I had suddenly awakened. He seized my wrist so tightly it hurt. "I told you not to come out here," he whispered. He didn't sound angry. He sounded terrified. I looked over his shoulder, and for just a second, I thought I saw the tall figure standing several rows behind him. It was outside the reach of the light, watching us. I tried to point, but my father pulled me away before I could speak. As we hurried back to the house, something moved through the crops behind us. It never came close enough for me to see it clearly, but it followed at the same steady pace, stopping whenever we stopped and moving whenever we moved. My father never looked back. Once we were inside, he locked every door and closed all the curtains. I asked him what had been standing in the field. He wouldn't answer. I asked him about the red stone. He told me never to mention it again. Neither of us slept that night. I heard him walking through the kitchen until morning, checking the locks and staring through the curtains. The following day, our neighbor stopped me near the road. He asked why someone had been screaming on our property around midnight. I told him it must have been an animal. The strange thing was, I didn't remember hearing any screaming. 3 days later, I overheard my father speaking with a real estate agent. He wanted to sell the farmhouse, the equipment, and every acre of land. When I asked him why, he said running the farm had become too much for the two of us. But I knew that wasn't the real reason. By Christmas, we had moved into town. My father is older now. Whenever I bring up that night, he says his memory isn't what it used to be. But I know he remembers. Sometimes I still dream about the figure beneath that amber light. In the dream, it raises its hand and calls me forward. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I see the red stone resting in my palm. I've spent years wondering what would have happened if my father had arrived 30 seconds later. I wonder whether I would have picked up that stone. And I wonder whether I would have come home at all. Hey, I want to share with you a couple of stories that have really stayed with me over the years. They're about family, memories, and those little moments when the past seems to reach out in the most unexpected ways. So, grab a seat, maybe a cup of something warm, and let me tell you about the balloon and the smoking visitor. First, let's talk about the story I like to call the balloon. For years, I worked at this small grocery store out in the American Midwest, an overnight stalker and eventually the weekend manager. The place was family-owned for generations, and my family had been close to them since the very beginning. The owners weren't just people who ran the business. They were like family friends who'd come over for gatherings, holidays, and just to catch up. The owner back then, the father of the current owner, let's call him Ben instead of Bob, was this kind, hard-working man who poured his heart into the store for over 3 decades. He worked 10 to 12 hours a day, every day, and to us younger folks, he was kind of like a grandfather figure. When Ben passed away in late 2010, it hit all of us hard. The store felt emptier somehow, like a light had dimmed. A few years after he left us, I started working there myself. Because of my family's connection, I moved up to overnight stalker and then weekend manager pretty quickly. Over time, strange things started happening, usually between 3 and 5 in the morning, the eeriest hours. Shelves would mysteriously shake and drop cans or boxes. Automatic doors would slide open with no one around, and the motion-activated lottery machines would chime as if a customer were there, though the store was empty. We talked about it among ourselves and eventually told the current owner. He just chuckled and said, "That's gotta be Ben." Most of the time, these little hauntings were harmless. It felt like Ben was just watching over the store, making sure everything was all right, and never wanting to scare customers. No one ever reported seeing him directly, and honestly, I never had a direct encounter either. Until the night of what I call the balloon. That night, I was working my usual overnight shift, from about 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. The grocery truck was smaller than usual, so by 3 a.m., all the grocery stock was up, and I only had the dairy section left. My 2 coworkers, who didn't have to stay past the groceries, headed out right at 3. So there I was, completely alone in this huge, quiet store. Picture it. The soft hum of the refrigerator units, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, and the occasional creak of the building settling. I was filling the shelves with milk, cheese, and yogurt, and my mind started to wander. Suddenly, a clear image popped into my head, the face of Ben, wearing that warm, tired smile he always had after a long day. It was so vivid, I could almost hear his gentle chuckle. Feeling a little nostalgic and a bit sad, I decided to take a quick break. I grabbed my drink and headed down the aisle. As I rounded the corner, I was hit by this sudden icy chill, like the coldest spot in the entire store. And then I saw it. A bright balloon floating right at chest level, just a few feet from me. Written on it were the words, "Thank you," glowing in bold, cheerful letters. I froze. The balloon had no business being there. I was in the far corner of the store, and there was no draft or breeze that could have carried it from the other side. The silence around me felt heavier, almost like the air itself was holding its breath. After a minute or so, I forced myself to move, slowly stepping around the balloon as if not to disturb it. I headed to the back office and checked the security cameras, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Sure enough, the balloon was drifting slowly down the dairy aisle, glowing softly in the dim light. I smiled to myself and whispered, "All right, Ben, I'll finish up before I go." So back I went to the aisle, working with the balloon floating gently nearby, like a quiet companion. I finished stocking the dairy products over the next hour, feeling oddly comforted. When I was done, I carefully carried the balloon to the floral department and gently deflated it. I laid it flat on the desk and left a little note for the morning shift worker, one of Ben's granddaughters. It simply said, "From Ben." That night, I felt like I'd shared a quiet moment with a friend who had never really left. Now, the second story is about my grandfather, who was a man with a very particular habit. He smoked. Cigars mostly, though he dabbled in cigarettes and home-rolled ones too. He carried his cigars in a special metal case, hand-carved and worn from years of use. His job was stressful, a government position that kept him on edge most days, and that's where the habit started. Even after he retired, he kept smoking up until the day he passed away. I was pretty young then, under 10, but the smell of his cigars is something I'll never forget. It wasn't a scent I liked, to be honest. I never liked smoking, but it was so distinct and tied to him that whenever I caught a whiff, it meant one thing. Grandpa was near. Even years after his passing, my grandmother would tell us about visits from Grandpa. She'd say they'd sit and talk for hours, like he was still right there beside her. At times, she'd complain about the lingering cigar smoke that would hang in the air long after he'd left. At first, I thought it was just her way of coping with the loss, imagining him still around. But then it wasn't just her. My mom, stepfather, and uncle all started having similar experiences. They'd be alone, in the house or even the car, and suddenly, that unmistakable cigar smoke would fill the room, overpowering every other smell. The temperature would drop suddenly, even in the heat of summer, and my mom said she could sometimes hear him coughing softly, as if from inside the walls or above the ceiling. She told me, "One day he'll come visit you too. You'll know him by that smell, even beyond the grave." And she was right. We were on a family road trip down Route 66, heading to Las Vegas for a week-long stay. I was 16 at the time, and it had been a while since anyone mentioned Grandpa's visits. I thought maybe he'd finally moved on for good. But then, 3 days into our drive, we were crossing New Mexico. It was over 100 degrees outside, a blazing, cloudless sky stretching endlessly over the desert. Just me, my mom, and stepdad in a small blue sedan, cruising along a nearly empty highway. Suddenly, my mom gasped, and all of a sudden, the air was thick with that cigar smell. It was so strong, it filled the car completely and enveloped my senses. My mind was flooded with memories and thoughts of Grandpa, and despite the scorching heat, I felt a sudden, icy breeze sweep through the car. It was surreal and a bit chilling. "We have a visitor," my mom said quietly. The smell lingered for miles, wrapping around us like a ghostly embrace. Then slowly it faded, and the oppressive heat came flooding back. That was the only time I've ever been visited by Grandpa in such a real way. But other family members have had their own experiences with him since, even as recently as this year. So yeah, these are stories that remind me of how the people we love don't really leave us. Sometimes they show up in balloons floating silently in an empty grocery store, or in the unmistakable scent of a cigar on a hot desert road. It's a strange, beautiful kind of haunting, one filled with warmth, memories, and a little bit of magic. Thanks for listening. I grew up in a coastal town in southern India where the summers were so hot and humid that even the walls seemed to hold on to the heat. I was about 22 at the time, still living with my parents while finishing college. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor. One of the bedrooms opened onto a narrow balcony, and just outside it stood an enormous old banyan tree. At night, the branches would scrape against the railing whenever the wind picked up. From a distance, the tree looked unsettling, almost human in shape. But I had grown up playing beneath it, so I never really thought of it as frightening. My parents slept in the smaller bedroom across the living room. I shared the larger room with my younger siblings, although they were often away during the day. Back then, I used to tutor a few neighborhood children in the evenings. It gave me enough money to cover books, bus fares, and other small expenses. One afternoon, I came home from college feeling completely exhausted. I still had some time before my tutoring session, so I decided to take a quick nap. It was unbearably warm. I switched off the lights and left the bedroom door and balcony windows open, hoping a breeze might come through. My mother was resting in her room on the other side of the apartment. The tiled floor felt cooler than the bed, so I spread out a thin sheet and lay down facing the wall. A few minutes later, just as I was beginning to drift off, I felt someone lie down beside me. I remember the floor shifting slightly under their weight. Then I felt a body settle very close to my back. I assumed one of my siblings had come home without me hearing them. I was too sleepy to turn around and check. Then an arm slowly rested across my waist. It felt completely real. There was warmth, pressure, and the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing behind me. Strangely, I did not feel afraid. I simply thought, they must be tired too. I must have dozed off for a few minutes because the next thing I heard was my mother calling from across the apartment. She asked whether I was getting ready to leave for tutoring. I opened my eyes and turned around. There was no one beside me. The room was empty. I sat up immediately and looked toward the balcony, then under the bed, even though there was nowhere anyone could have hidden. I walked to my mother's room and asked whether either of my siblings had come home. She looked confused. "No," she said. "It's only you and me here." I did not tell her what had happened. I convinced myself that I had been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I had felt. Several months later, my parents installed an air conditioner in their bedroom. Since the weather was especially hot that week, the entire family decided to sleep in there together. We placed 2 mattresses on the floor, locked the bedroom door, and went to sleep. My parents always kept a small green nightlight glowing near the wardrobe. It was dim, but bright enough to make out the shapes in the room. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of my father moving around. He suddenly switched on every light and began checking behind the curtains and near the bathroom door. I asked him what was wrong. He said my mother believed someone had entered the apartment. We searched every room. The main door was still locked from the inside. The balcony doors were closed. Nothing had been disturbed. There was no one there. The next morning, I quietly asked my mother what she had seen. She hesitated before answering. She said she had woken to the sound of someone crying. Not loudly. It was a soft, broken, sobbing sound coming from the foot of the bed. When she opened her eyes, she saw a woman sitting beside my mattress. The woman's head was lowered, and long hair covered most of her face. In the green light, my mother could not see any features. She could only see a dark figure with narrow shoulders, sitting perfectly still and crying. Because the figure was so close to me, my mother assumed it was me. She asked, "What happened? Why are you crying?" The sobbing stopped immediately. The woman slowly stood up. Then she walked toward the bedroom door. My mother watched her cross the room and disappear into the living area. That was when she woke my father, believing someone had broken into the apartment. As she told me this, I felt cold despite the morning heat. I finally told her about the afternoon when I had felt someone lying beside me. Neither of us knew what to say after that. To this day, we still do not know who the woman was. There were other small incidents over the years. My mother occasionally heard quiet crying near her bed. Sometimes she felt someone standing behind her while she folded clothes or prayed. She eventually learned not to react. Whatever lived in that apartment never harmed us. It never threw objects, opened doors, or tried to frighten us. It simply seemed to be there, sometimes beside us, sometimes watching from the darkness, and sometimes, late at night, quietly crying as though it had been waiting for someone to listen. So, this happened just after my best friend Eli and I started university. We had always imagined we would attend the same school, but the courses we wanted were offered at different universities. In the end, we had to go our separate ways. Eli wanted to experience living independently, so he rented a room in the city. His first place was a disaster. The landlady charged the tenants unfairly, went through their belongings, and even called them to complain about how they arranged things in their own rooms. It was completely unreasonable. Eventually, Eli decided to leave. He called me because he was short on taxi fare, so I sent him enough money to move his things. After the mid-semester break, he found another house with surprisingly cheap rent. That should have been the first warning. The house was on Blackwood Street, one of the most dangerous streets in the city. I knew the area well because I had lived nearby before, and, trust me, it was not a place you wanted to walk around after dark. But Eli was desperate, and the rent was affordable, so he moved in with a few other students. That was when the strange things began. One night, one of his roommates, a girl named Maria, was sitting on the living room couch with her laptop. The couch was right beside Eli's bedroom door. While she was working, she heard the bedroom door open. Then she heard footsteps walk from Eli's room, cross the hallway, enter the kitchen, and return to the bedroom. Maria assumed it was Eli, so she called his name. There was no answer. She called again, but the house stayed silent. Feeling uneasy, she stood up and checked the room. Nobody was inside. A little shaken, Maria went to tell her boyfriend, who was also staying at the house. Not long afterward, Eli returned from running errands and found everyone sitting together in the living room. He asked what was wrong, and they explained what Maria had heard. Eli was skeptical. He thought there had to be a normal explanation, so he sat down with them. And then he heard it too. The bedroom door creaked open. Footsteps crossed the hallway, moved into the kitchen, and slowly returned to his empty room. That was the first incident. After that, things became much worse. 2 days later, Eli came home from class and was stopped by a neighbor. The man said he had heard people shouting inside the house earlier that day. He described what sounded like a violent argument, followed by someone crying. The problem was that nobody had been home. That evening, Eli told his roommates what the neighbor had said. They were already frightened, but they tried to convince themselves that the sounds might have come from somewhere else. A little later, Eli walked toward the front door. That was when he saw something standing on the porch. It looked like a person, but it was completely black, darker than the night around it. Its back was turned toward him, and it stood perfectly still. Eli quietly told his roommate not to look outside. Of course, his roommate looked anyway. The moment he saw the figure, his whole body began to shake. Nobody wanted to stay silent anymore. The roommates confronted the landlord and demanded the truth. That was when he admitted he already knew the house had a history. Years earlier, someone had died there under horrific circumstances. The victim had been found decapitated. The landlord also revealed that nearly every tenant before them had moved out within a week. Some had heard voices. Others had seen figures in the hallway or woken up feeling as though someone was standing beside their beds. Eli and his roommates were terrified, but they could not afford to move immediately. In desperation, they invited a priest to bless the house. For a brief moment, they hoped it had worked. It had not. The activity became more intense. Doors slammed by themselves. Footsteps moved through the rooms at night. Sometimes they heard crying behind the walls, followed by a voice whispering words they could not understand. It felt as though the blessing had only made whatever lived there angry. Finally, everyone agreed to leave. On the night before they moved out, Eli woke suddenly in the middle of the night. He did not know what had disturbed him at first. Then he noticed someone standing at the foot of his bed. The figure was tall and motionless. Eli slowly looked upward. He saw filthy clothing hanging from a decaying body. The skin looked dark and rotten, and the smell in the room was unbearable. His eyes moved higher, toward the figure's shoulders, but he stopped before reaching the neck. He was too afraid to see what was above it. Eli shut his eyes and stayed completely still until morning. The next day, he and his roommates packed everything they could carry and left the house on Blackwood Street. None of them ever went back. Hi, it's nearly 1 in the morning, and sleep clearly has no interest in me tonight. So I thought I'd tell you about 3 strange things that have happened to me over the years. I should probably start by saying that I don't really believe in ghosts or anything paranormal. I love horror movies, creepy stories, abandoned buildings, all of that. But enjoying scary things and believing they're real are completely different. When I was a kid, I watched Insidious with my parents. It was my first proper horror movie, and it terrified me. Afterward, I became convinced that something might grab me while I was sleeping. I had my own room, which suddenly felt much bigger and darker than it had before. One night, I was waiting for a cartoon to come on television, but I got tired and decided to sleep. I lay on my stomach and pulled the blanket completely over my body. That had become my little safety ritual. I was just starting to drift off when I felt something touch my feet, and I promise you, I was awake. At first, it felt like a small pressure on top of the blanket, almost as though someone was sitting near the end of the bed. Then the pressure slowly became heavier. A moment later, it felt exactly like a hand closing around my ankle. Then it disappeared. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just lay there under the blanket, sweating and trying not to breathe too loudly. I was terrified that if I looked toward the foot of the bed, I would see someone sitting there. Somehow, I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I told my parents, but they assumed I'd dreamed it. We didn't have any pets, and my younger sister was still a toddler. There wasn't anyone who could have entered my room without me hearing them. Even now, I can still remember the weight of that hand. The second incident happened a few years later. I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed that my bedroom door was slightly open. Through the gap, I could see part of someone's face. Just their eyes, forehead, and a little bit of their hair. I thought it was my mother checking on me. I wasn't fully awake, so I didn't say anything. I simply closed my eyes and went back to sleep. Later that morning, I asked her why she had been watching me from the doorway. She looked completely confused. She told me she hadn't come into my room at all that night. I asked my sister too, but she had no idea what I was talking about. The strangest part is that I can't clearly remember the face. I remember seeing someone, but the details are missing, almost as though my mind refuses to hold on to them. Since that night, I always sleep with my bedroom door completely closed. The third incident happened much more recently, after I had moved into a small apartment by myself. One evening, I was lying on the couch, scrolling through videos on my phone and slowly falling asleep. The apartment was quiet, and nothing unusual had happened. Then I suddenly felt that someone was standing beside me. You know that feeling when you can sense a person leaning close, even before you turn your head? It felt exactly like that. More specifically, it felt as though someone's face was only a few inches from mine, watching me sleep. I opened my eyes and looked around. There was nobody there. The room was empty, but the feeling didn't vanish immediately. It lingered for several seconds, heavy and unmistakable, before finally fading. Those are the three experiences I still can't explain. I know tiredness can make the mind do strange things. I know fear can turn shadows into faces and ordinary sensations into something much worse. Maybe every one of these incidents has a perfectly reasonable explanation. But I also know what I felt. I know what I saw. And even though I still don't believe in the paranormal, there are nights when I lie awake wondering whether something can exist without needing us to believe in it. You know, in Chinese tradition, the 7th month of the lunar calendar is often called Ghost Month. People believe that during this time, the boundary between the living and the dead becomes thinner. The gates of the spirit world are said to open, allowing restless souls to wander through our streets, homes, and quiet places after dark. Even now, in cities such as Hong Kong, you can sometimes feel the mood shift. You might notice small fires glowing beside the road as families burn paper offerings. Bowls of food may be left near doorways. Incense smoke drifts through narrow streets, and older people quietly remind their families not to stay out too late. Some call it superstition. Others call it respect. And for many people, it is simply safer not to challenge traditions that have survived for generations. There was one night in September 2025 that made people especially uneasy. It arrived during the middle of Ghost Month, not long after the spirits were believed to have entered the human world. That night was also linked to a blood moon. Now, scientifically, a blood moon is only a lunar eclipse, but in old folklore, a red moon has often been treated as a warning, a sign that something is changing, a sign that the night may not be as ordinary as it appears. Certain traditional calendars also describe that period as unfavorable, a time when accidents, arguments, and misfortune were more likely. Of course, none of this is scientific proof. But what I find interesting is that many Ghost Month warnings contain a surprising amount of common sense. The first warning is simple: stay away from deep water at night. There are old stories about spirits of people who drowned. According to legend, these spirits cannot move on until someone else takes their place, so they wait near rivers, reservoirs, beaches, and dark ponds. Maybe you do not believe that. Still, swimming or fishing alone at night is dangerous. The water is harder to read, the ground may be slippery, and nobody may hear you if something goes wrong. The second warning is not to take careless photographs after midnight, especially near mirrors. Mirrors in elevators, hotel hallways, bathrooms, and empty buildings are sometimes believed to attract things that do not belong in our world. People say you might look at the photograph later and notice a shadow behind you, a pale face in the corner, or an extra figure that was never there when you pressed the button. The third warning is not to suddenly touch someone on the shoulder. Traditional belief says every person carries 3 protective flames, one above the forehead and one over each shoulder. These flames are said to guard us from wandering spirits. A sudden tap may weaken one of them. Covering the forehead for too long is also believed to hide the brightest flame. Whether that is true or not, frightening someone on a dark and empty street is probably never a good idea. The fourth warning is to leave roadside offerings alone. During Ghost Month, fruit, rice, incense, paper money, and small gifts may be placed on the ground for wandering souls. Do not step over them. Do not kick them aside. And never pick them up simply because they look interesting. To the person who left them there, those objects are not rubbish. They are part of a promise, a prayer, or an act of remembrance. The final warning is one people still whisper about. Do not travel alone too late, and be careful about taking the final bus of the night. There are stories of passengers boarding nearly empty buses and realizing that some of the people sitting quietly in the back have no reflections in the window. Others say spirits prefer lonely streets, silent stairwells, tunnels, and the dark spaces beside old walls. Perhaps these warnings are only ghost stories, or perhaps they are ancient safety lessons wrapped in mystery, passed down because people remember frightening stories more easily than ordinary advice. Either way, the message is almost the same. Stay away from dangerous water. Respect what others consider sacred. Do not wander alone through unfamiliar places. And do not disturb things you do not fully understand. You may not believe in ghosts, and that is perfectly fine. But imagine walking home beneath a deep red moon. The streets are empty. The incense fires behind you have almost burned out. Then, without warning, you feel a cold breath against the back of your neck. You turn around. Nobody is there. At least, nobody you can see. Hey, I want to share two pretty intense experiences with you. One that happened while I was working at a coffee shop, and another from a trip to Arizona. They're pretty different, but both stuck with me in ways I can't quite explain. So, the first one is about this moment at Starbucks. I was about 15 minutes into my shift, just getting into the rhythm of making drinks. I was actually in a really good mood that day. Right before I left for work, my husband and our roommate had stepped out to walk to this gas station just a block away. It was a sunny day, the kind that's not too hot but just perfect for a little walk. While I was busy behind the counter, the store phone rang. I remember hearing it clear across the room, and my eyes immediately locked onto my coworker because I just knew it was for me. We rarely got calls at the store, especially not personal ones, and honestly, I'd never had a personal call there before. There was no real reason to think it was for me, but something in my gut told me otherwise. It was one of those eerie moments where your whole body just knows. My coworker picked up the phone, and the instant she looked up, our eyes met, and that silence between us felt heavy, like something was hanging in the air. I smiled awkwardly, trying to keep the mood light, and I remember blurting out, "It's for me?" The tension was thick. You could almost hear it crackling. I stepped over quickly, and that's when my roommate was there, looking worried but trying to stay calm. His first words were, "First, I need you to stay calm." And I did. I told him I was calm, even though inside, my mind was racing. But strangely, I wasn't scared. It was like I already knew whatever was coming, it would pass. He explained that on their way to the gas station, a huge pickup truck ran a red light and hit them both. My roommate, being a big guy, caught the driver's attention and only stumbled a bit before the driver slammed on the brakes. But my husband, who's much smaller, was thrown to the ground and badly hurt. My roommate insisted on riding with him in the ambulance so he could update the family. He told me that my husband was still hurting, but was joking with the paramedics, optimistic about everything. They told me he was okay and that I didn't need to come to the hospital right away. And oddly enough, I already felt that was true before they even said it. I thanked my roommate, told my husband I loved him, joked a little to keep things light, and went back to work. I shared what happened with my coworkers, still trying to keep the mood casual, smiling through it all. They were freaking out, and the supervisor even asked if I wanted to leave to be with my husband, but I said I was fine. I wasn't stressed or worried. It felt like just a crazy start to the day. I'm sure it looked like I was trying to get the day off, especially since I knew the call was coming for me. But honestly, I just wanted to keep going. Thankfully, after a long stretch of physical therapy, my husband is doing great now. He even goes for walks to the gas station again, but with a slightly different route. I don't mind this kind of foresight if it helps me avoid another anxiety attack. Now, the second story takes us to Arizona, to this place called the Grand Canyon Hotel in Williams. We picked it mostly because it was affordable and has the reputation of being the oldest hotel in Arizona, which sounded kind of cool. The lobby was charming, decked out with all these historical items and currencies from travelers over the years. After checking in, the front desk told us to check out the rooms and decide which one we wanted. Walking up the stairs, we passed this old black and white photo of a lady from what looked like the late 1800s or early 1900s. It gave the place this antique vibe that was both beautiful and a little eerie. My friend and I were checking out different rooms when she said she felt something tap her on the shoulder. I teased her, saying, "Probably a ghost." But honestly, I was mostly just exhausted from the long drive from LA and excited for the next day's trip on the Grand Canyon Railway. I picked a room near a hallway, that one with the sailor uniform displayed inside. It was a real uniform from the war, which added a strange historical weight to the room. I went to bed around midnight, feeling peaceful for once. No paranoid thoughts, just ready to rest. But then, about an hour later, I started hearing footsteps outside my door. I told myself it was probably other guests, so I tried to drift back to sleep. The footsteps came again, this time inside the room. I was terrified. I snapped my eyes open, sat up in bed, but there was nothing there. Just silence. I told myself to calm down and went back to sleep. Now, the bed was super soft, so if you sat on one side, it would tilt completely. I was just settling back in when the footsteps returned, this time running around inside the room. I kept my eyes shut tight, but I could feel my arms moving up and down, like there was something walking on my bed. I hesitated, then finally opened my eyes. Right in front of me were two incredibly pale little buttocks. My head was between the legs, and it was clearly a child's small, pale bluish skin. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, just a child's body. My heart pounded hard, and I closed my eyes again, trying to steady my breathing. When I opened them a moment later, it was gone. There was silence. After a few minutes, I grabbed my phone and watched some episodes of The Office to calm down, eventually falling asleep close to 6 a.m. The next morning, I asked the front desk if they'd had any ghost reports. They said no. But if anyone else has stayed there and experienced something similar, I'd love to hear about it. That night was my first real haunting, and it changed how I see the paranormal. I used to be so skeptical, but now, I'm a firm believer. Sometimes, the silence and the shadows have stories to tell, and maybe that little visitor was just trying to say hello. This happened a little over 2 years ago, during the middle of winter. It was sometime after midnight, and my mother and I were driving home through rural Ohio in my old Chevy pickup. The night was unbelievably dark. Even with the high beams on, the road seemed to disappear only a few yards ahead of us, swallowed by this thick, endless blackness. We had been at the hospital, visiting my grandmother. She had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, the same illness that had taken my grandfather many years earlier. Her condition was getting worse quickly, so the whole evening had been emotionally exhausting. Still, neither of us was especially tired. We had stopped at a familiar diner for something to eat, and nothing unusual had happened. It felt like an ordinary, sad night. Then we left the highway. The traffic light at the end of the exit ramp turned green, and I made a right onto a long stretch of country road. The moment we turned, something changed. My mother and I both felt it at exactly the same time. It was an overwhelming sense of dread, deeper than ordinary fear. It felt like something had entered the truck with us, something cold and watchful. The air seemed heavier, and the road ahead looked darker than it had a moment before. Even the music sounded wrong. Every song on the radio suddenly seemed slower and slightly out of tune, as though the sound itself had been bent. I changed the station twice, but every voice and every instrument carried the same strange, distorted quality. Eventually, I turned the radio off. For the next 20 minutes, we drove in silence. Every few minutes, one of us would quietly ask, "Are you still feeling it?" And the answer was always yes. Neither of us wanted to look in the rearview mirror. I cannot explain why. We just had this shared certainty that looking behind us would somehow make things worse. The darkness felt alive. It seemed to press against the windows, following the truck as we moved. We began praying together. We repeated the same prayers again and again, trying to calm ourselves, but the feeling never lifted. If anything, it grew stronger. The road eventually passed through a small farming community. Just outside of town was an old cemetery surrounded by a low iron fence. I knew the area well, and normally there were always other vehicles around, especially freight trucks. That night, we had not seen a single car. I slowed from about 60 miles per hour to 45. A few minutes before the cemetery, we passed a narrow side road. that was when we saw it. There was a massive black dog standing in the opposite lane. It was not walking across the road. It was not sniffing the ground or wandering along the shoulder. It was simply standing there, perfectly still, facing us. The dog was enormous. Its shoulders were nearly level with the front grille of my truck. Its fur was so black that I could barely make out its shape against the night, even in the headlights. But I could see its face. Its mouth looked far too wide, filled with large, exposed teeth. It was not growling or barking. It was just baring them at us. And its eyes did not look like a dog's eyes. They were too large, too focused, and disturbingly aware. It stared directly through the windshield at me. Not at the truck. At me. As we passed, I glanced into the side mirror before I could stop myself. The dog had already turned around. It was still standing in the road, watching us drive away. My mother and I both shouted at the same moment. Neither of us had described what we were seeing while it happened, but when we started talking, our descriptions matched exactly. We agreed that it did not resemble a wolf or a stray farm dog. It looked more like an enormous black mastiff, only its proportions were wrong, especially the mouth and the eyes. We continued into the next town, where there were streetlights and a few houses close to the road. I expected the fear to fade once we reached a brighter area. It did not. The feeling became even more suffocating. As we drove, both of us began noticing dark figures near the roadside. They seemed to be standing behind signs, trees, and utility poles. Whenever the headlights moved across them, they vanished or became ordinary shadows. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a small community school. The lot was covered in bright white security lights, and there were cameras mounted on nearly every corner of the building. We sat there for several minutes, checking the mirrors and watching the empty playground. Nothing moved. There was nobody around. But the feeling was still there. After about 15 minutes, my mother told me we could not stay there all night. She asked me to keep driving, so I pulled back onto the road. When we finally reached home, I parked beneath the covered driveway, and we ran straight inside without gathering any of our things. We locked every door and turned on every light. For the next few hours, we stayed awake in the living room, listening for footsteps, scratching, barking, or anything else outside. There was only silence. Sometime before dawn, the feeling slowly began to disappear. It did not stop suddenly. It faded little by little, like something moving farther away from the house. Eventually, we went to bed. My mother and I still talk about that night occasionally. Every time we retell it, the details remain the same. The empty road, the distorted music, the figures beside the signs, and that enormous black dog staring through the windshield as though it had been waiting specifically for us. I still do not know what we saw. I only know that, for those few hours, it felt as though something followed us out of the darkness and did not leave until it was ready. Hey, I want to share this story with you about a trip my friend and I took back in 2011. It's about this peculiar experience we had at a hotel in Williams, Arizona, the Grand Canyon Inn. It's a bit eerie, but bear with me. I think you'll find it interesting. So, my name's Emily. I'm originally from Australia, and the friend I was traveling with, Jake, is from New York. We were on a bit of a last-minute road trip. Nothing fancy planned, just the open road, the thrill of discovery, and the joy of each other's company. We drove from Las Vegas that day, and by early evening, we found ourselves in Williams. Honestly, we didn't plan to stop there. It was just a dot on the map that somehow felt right to pull over at. Now, I've always believed that the heart of a town holds its stories, the real charm. So I suggested we find a place right in the center, something with history or character. We stumbled upon this old hotel, the Grand Canyon Inn. When we walked in, the lobby was almost deserted, quiet except for the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet and the soft hum of an old ceiling fan somewhere above. The walls were adorned with sepia-toned photographs of people from long ago, faces staring out with a kind of faded life. It was a little unsettling at first, those eyes almost following us as we moved, but the excitement of being somewhere with history quickly overtook that feeling. A couple of folks appeared from behind the desk, probably the owners or managers, and they led us upstairs. The hallway was lined with more photographs, each one bulging slightly from its frame, giving an odd, three-dimensional effect that made me shiver. I remember thinking it was like stepping back in time, but with a shadow of something unspoken lurking in the air. There were several rooms to choose from, each with a theme. There was a nautical one that looked inviting, but I wanted a room with a window facing the street. I guess I just like to see what's going on outside, and I wanted to keep an eye on the car parked down the side street below. We settled in what the hotel called the honeymoon suite. It seemed cozy, with a nice little ensuite bathroom, which was a bonus. Here's where it started to get a bit strange. On the wall next to the bed hung an old wedding dress, yellowed, delicate, almost fragile looking. It was behind glass, but you could see the intricate lace and the faded satin. The woman at the desk told us they found it inside an old chest buried out in the nearby desert. Jake and I exchanged a glance then, raising our eyebrows, but brushed it off. It felt more like a story to add atmosphere than a real haunting. After checking in, we wandered up the street to a rock and roll themed diner, a place full of neon lights and classic cars painted on the walls. We had a hearty meal and enjoyed the buzz of the lively crowd, a nice contrast to the quiet hotel. When we got back, Jake mentioned he didn't like the dress hanging right there in the room. I agreed. It was the first thing your eyes landed on when you walked in, and it gave me the creeps. So, gently, I took it down and placed it in the cupboard between the ensuite and the room's door. On the other side of the bed, above the radiator, was a pair of long, white gloves, like those debutante gloves you see in old movies. The warmth from the radiator caused the fingers to twitch and move slightly. We noticed this and laughed quietly, realizing the heat was making the gloves dance. It was more amusing than frightening, especially since it was late November and quite chilly outside. That night, around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of creaking floorboards. Now, usually, I just listen for a moment, recognize it as the old building settling, or maybe other guests moving around, and drift back to sleep. But this time, the creaking sounded different, like it was happening inside our room, not out in the hallway. I felt Jake beside me, so it wasn't him getting up. My heart started to race. I quietly lifted my head, eyes still closed, hoping to catch a glimpse if someone was there. But there was nothing. The room was still, and the faint moonlight filtering through the window cast long shadows across the floor. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the old boards shifting, and soon I fell back into a light sleep. But then, about an hour later, the sound returned. This time, it was unmistakably footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the room towards the bedside. The noise repeated a couple of times, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I was wide awake now, heart pounding, every nerve on edge. Jake stirred, nudging me softly as if asking, "Did you hear that?" I sat up slowly, turning on the bedside lamp. The room flooded with warm light, but the space was empty. The footsteps had started near the door, close to the cupboard where we'd hidden the wedding dress, then moved across to the side of the bed where the dress had been hanging. I swear, for a moment, I could almost feel a presence standing there, quiet, watching. I checked the door, locked tight, then went to the bathroom to splash some cold water on my face. When I came back, I paced the room a bit, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. I wanted Jake to feel safe, so I made sure to keep the lights on. We stayed awake together for the next hour and a half, dozing lightly but never fully asleep. It wasn't until dawn, when the soft morning light seeped through the curtains and made the room feel less ominous, that we finally relaxed enough to catch some deeper sleep. The next morning, as we checked out, we mentioned the strange noises and the footsteps to the hotel staff. Their faces went blank, not unfriendly, but there was this awkward silence, like they didn't want to talk about it. It was a little unsettling. We headed to a nearby snowboarder-themed cafe for breakfast, the place alive with chatter and the aroma of fresh coffee and pancakes. Over our meal, Jake and I recounted the night's events, both agreeing that something unexplainable had happened. Was it the wedding dress? The old gloves? Or just the quirks of an ancient building? We couldn't say for sure, but it felt far from random noises. To anyone wondering about the Grand Canyon Inn, there's definitely something strange there. A whisper of the past that lingers in the air. And speaking of lessons learned, we didn't heed ours that night. The next evening, we checked into the Monte Vista Hotel in Flagstaff, only to find ourselves not staying the entire night. But that, my friend, is another story for another time. For a little context, I did use AI to help reshape this story. It helped me organize my memories and describe certain moments more clearly, but the experience itself is true to the best of my recollection. I'm also planning to draw what I saw. That image has stayed with me all these years, and I still remember the layout of my parents' property almost perfectly. This happened in rural Nash County, North Carolina, and it wasn't the only strange encounter I had around that time. I was probably 22 or 23 when this happened. I'm in my early 50s now, and I honestly can't remember the exact year. I don't even remember why I had moved back into my parents' place for a while. A lot of that period has become blurry. Work, relationships, trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. You know how those years can all run together. But that night has never left me. I was in my bedroom with my friend Jared. Everybody called him Jerry back then. We were waiting for another friend of ours, Andy, to show up. The plan was pretty simple. Andy was bringing a couple of large beers, and we were going to sit around, listen to music, drink, and talk until late. Nothing unusual. We were young, and none of us had anywhere important to be the next morning. It was sometime after midnight. I remember the house had gone quiet because my parents were already asleep. They lived in a double-wide out in the country. There was a long wooden porch across the front that my mother had helped build. She could make or repair just about anything when she put her mind to it. The driveway was gravel and curved around the house. You could always hear someone arriving because the tires would crunch and grind over the stones long before the car reached the porch. That night, Andy came up the driveway much faster than usual. Jerry and I noticed the sound, but we didn't think much of it. We just figured he was in a hurry. A few moments later, Andy rushed into my bedroom. He looked genuinely frightened. He said, "Man, something almost came down on top of my car." I laughed at first. I thought he was joking because my friends knew I'd seen unexplained things in the sky before. I figured he was trying to get a reaction out of me. But Andy wasn't smiling. He said some kind of object had passed extremely close over his car while he was driving toward the house. He wanted us to come outside and look. So the three of us walked onto the porch. And when I say it was dark out there, I mean real country darkness. There were no streetlights, no businesses nearby, no glowing signs or parking lots. The homes along that road were separated by fields, trees, and long stretches of empty land. Once you stepped away from the light inside the house, the darkness seemed to close around you. Behind the house was a wide stretch of woods. The tree line may have been 200 or 300 feet away. I can't be certain anymore. I just remember that it was close enough to reach quickly on foot. The woods formed a dark wall across the back of the property. Andy started telling us exactly what had happened on the road, but I wasn't really listening. I was already scanning the sky above the trees. Then I noticed something off to the left. It looked like it was hovering near the tree line, several properties away. Out there, that could mean a pretty good distance because the houses weren't close together. My first thought was that it had to be a helicopter. That was the only explanation my mind could come up with. From where we stood, the shape was difficult to understand, and it seemed to be hanging in one place. I remember saying, "It's probably just a helicopter." Then the object turned. As soon as it changed direction, I knew I was wrong. It wasn't a helicopter. The central part of it looked long, almost like a thick cigar or capsule. Around the main body were 4 bright spheres of light. They seemed evenly spaced, almost as though each one marked a corner around the object. I don't remember seeing windows. I don't remember markings, panels, anything that looked like ordinary machinery. What I remember is that long shape and those 4 glowing lights. It began moving above the trees, and it made absolutely no sound. That silence is still one of the clearest parts of the memory. A helicopter that close would have been loud. We would have heard rotors, engines, or at least some kind of vibration traveling across the fields. But there was nothing. The object moved toward the house without making even the faintest noise. It didn't fly the way an airplane flies. It didn't tilt or struggle to stay in the air. It simply glided forward, slowly and smoothly, as though it had no weight at all. The 3 of us stood there watching it. Nobody said a word. At first, I was fascinated, but that feeling changed when I realized it was coming directly toward us. There's a big difference between seeing something strange in the distance and watching it move closer to where you're standing. One moment, you feel like you're observing it. The next moment, you feel like it might be observing you. It passed near the house and then stopped behind us, hovering just above the trees. It was close enough that the fear hit me all at once. I was terrified. There's really no polished way to say it. I was scared out of my mind. The object stayed there for several seconds, completely still and completely silent. The 3 of us were standing out in the open on that porch, staring up at it. I don't know whether it was watching us. I don't know whether stopping there had any meaning at all. But standing beneath it, the pause felt deliberate. Then it started moving again. It drifted away from the house and continued over the woods. There was no sudden flash, no burst of speed, and no roar of an engine. It simply moved farther into the darkness until we couldn't see it anymore. We stayed on the porch for a while after that, staring toward the place where it had disappeared. Nothing else happened. Eventually, the night became quiet and ordinary again. But none of us felt ordinary. We hadn't started drinking before Andy arrived. None of us had taken drugs. We were completely sober when we stepped outside, and we were sober when we watched that object move silently above the trees. More than 30 years have passed since then. I understand that memory can change over time. Distances can shift. Small details can fade, while others become strangely sharp. That's one reason I still ask Andy and Jared about that night. Every few years I bring it up and compare their memories with mine. Part of me wants reassurance that it really happened the way I remember it. And their accounts have always remained remarkably close to my own. To this day, I still don't know what we saw. I can't tell you where it came from or why it stopped near the house. All I can tell you is that the 3 of us stood on that porch and watched it. And whatever it was really there. So, this happened when I was around 22 years old. I'm in my early 50s now, and honestly, I can't remember the exact year or even why I had moved back into my parents' place at the time. A lot of that period has blurred together. Work, relationships, trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. You know how those years can be. But that night has never faded. I was in my bedroom with my friend Jared. Everybody called him Germ. We were waiting for another friend of ours, Aaron, to show up. The plan was simple. He was bringing a few large bottles of beer, and we were going to sit around, drink, listen to music, and waste the night away. It was sometime after midnight. My parents had already gone to bed, but friends showing up late wasn't unusual back then, so I wasn't worried about disturbing anyone. My parents lived in a manufactured home out in the countryside of eastern North Carolina. There was a long wooden porch across the front that my mother had helped build. The driveway was gravel and curved around the house, so you could always hear somebody arriving. Tires crunching over those stones carried through the night before the headlights even reached the porch. When Aaron pulled in, his car seemed unusually loud. I noticed it, but I didn't think much about it. Germ and I heard him stop outside, and we expected him to walk in like normal. Instead, he came rushing into my bedroom. He looked genuinely rattled. He said, "Man, something almost came down on top of my car." I laughed because I thought he was joking. My friends knew I'd seen strange lights in the sky before, things I couldn't explain, so I assumed he was trying to mess with me. But Aaron wasn't smiling. He said something had flown extremely low over his car while he was driving toward the house. He wanted us to come outside and look. The three of us walked onto the porch. And when I say it was dark, I mean real country darkness. No streetlights, no glowing stores in the distance, no traffic lighting up the road. The houses were spread far apart, with fields and wooded land between them. Once you stepped away from the light coming through the windows, the darkness seemed almost solid. The woods began a few hundred feet behind the house. I couldn't give you the exact distance now, but they were close enough that you could reach the tree line quickly. Those trees stretched in both directions, forming a dark wall beneath the sky. Aaron was explaining what had passed over his car, but I was only half listening. I was staring above the woods, trying to find anything unusual. Then I saw it. It was off to our left, maybe several properties down the road. Out there, that could still mean a fair distance because the homes weren't close together. At first, I thought it was a helicopter. That was the closest familiar explanation my mind could find. It appeared to be hovering near the tops of the trees, and from where we stood, I couldn't make out its full shape. I remember saying, "It's probably just a helicopter." Then the object changed direction. As soon as it turned, I knew I was wrong. It wasn't a helicopter. The main body looked long and narrow, almost like a cigar or a thick cylinder. Around it were 4 glowing lights. They seemed positioned around the object rather than lined up beneath it. I don't remember seeing windows. I don't remember markings, wings, rotors, or any visible machinery. I can't even tell you whether the surface looked metallic. What stayed with me was the long shape and those 4 steady lights. It began moving above the tree line. There was absolutely no sound. That silence is probably the strongest part of the memory. Anything flying that low should have made noise. A helicopter would have been pounding the air. An airplane would have had an engine sound. Even something unfamiliar should have caused some kind of hum, vibration, or disturbance. But there was nothing. It moved toward the house slowly and smoothly. It didn't glide like an airplane, and it didn't appear to be fighting gravity. It simply moved forward, calm and deliberate, as though the air wasn't affecting it at all. The three of us stood there watching. Nobody said a word. At first, I was fascinated. Then it became clear that the object wasn't just crossing the sky. It was coming toward us. That changed everything. There's a huge difference between noticing something strange in the distance and realizing that it is moving directly toward where you're standing. One moment, you're watching it. The next, you feel like it might be watching you. It passed close to the house and stopped behind us, hovering just above the trees. It was close enough that there was no longer any question that we were looking at a solid object. And I was terrified. There's no polished way to say it. I was scared out of my mind. The three of us were standing completely exposed on that porch, while this silent thing remained above the trees behind the house. It stayed there for several seconds. Maybe it was longer. Fear can stretch time in strange ways. I don't know whether it was observing us. I don't know whether stopping near the house meant anything. But standing there, it felt deliberate. It felt like it had come over to see who was watching. Then it started moving again. It continued away from the house, floating above the woods until it gradually disappeared into the darkness. There was no flash, no sudden acceleration, no dramatic burst into the sky. It simply moved out of sight with the same silence it had arrived in. We remained on the porch for a while, staring at the section of sky where it had vanished. Nothing else happened. The night went quiet again. Everything looked normal, but none of it felt normal anymore. And I want to make this clear. We hadn't started drinking yet. None of us had taken drugs. Aaron had only just arrived with the beer. We were completely sober when we stepped outside and watched that object travel over the trees. It has been roughly 30 years since that happened. I understand that memory changes. Distances can become uncertain. Small details can fade or shift. I've questioned my own recollection many times because I want to be honest about what I remember and what I don't. That's also why I still bring it up with Aaron and Jared from time to time. I ask what they remember, and I compare their version of the night with mine. The important parts have always matched. The shape, the four lights, the way it approached, the place where it stopped, and most of all, the silence. I still don't know what we saw that night. I only know that the three of us stood on that porch and watched something silent move above the trees. And whatever it was real. You know, I never expected a quiet Tuesday night to turn into something so unsettling. Let me tell you what happened, step by step, because every little detail still sticks with me. I was running across the parking lot, my heart pounding, and I dashed across the street, weaving around cars as rain started to fall. I aimed for the back of that old apartment building on Moray Street. Just as I reached out to touch the door, my fingers barely grazing the cold metal, I felt it. A single tiny drop of rain landed on the back of my hand. It was so faint, almost like a whisper from the sky. For a moment, it made me freeze, my mind racing. Was this real? Was I really here? Because the whole situation felt off. One drop became 2, then 10, until suddenly 100 raindrops were falling, drumming softly on the door and my jacket. That's when I shook myself out of the daze. This wasn't me. I'm not the kind of guy who runs across streets in the middle of a storm to knock on a stranger's door. Something was wrong. Maybe Reggie had gone through the same thing because I swear, I wasn't acting like myself at all. I wiped the rain from my face, tried to steady my breathing, and stepped inside. The hallway was dim and smelled faintly of damp wood and old paint. My eyes caught strange blue mesh bags piled in a corner. Garbage, I guess. But I noticed them this time, which was more than I could say for earlier. I was more alert now, more aware of the odd little things. I climbed the creaky stairs, each step groaning beneath my weight, and stopped at the door I'd come for. I knocked 3 times, hard and deliberate. "Come in," came a soft voice from inside. It was calm, almost inviting. "I just want to ask a few questions," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "About a friend of mine." "Come in," the voice repeated, a little clearer this time. I took a deep breath, reached for the handle, and it was unlocked. The door creaked open slowly, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't normal. A woman living alone, letting a complete stranger into her apartment at this hour? It felt wrong. I peered through the peephole, hoping to see her standing by the door, but all I saw was darkness. She wasn't there. Not really. "Could you come out for a moment?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It won't take long." "Come in," she said again. "I'm sorry to bother you, it's just... come in." My stomach twisted painfully. A cold, creeping chill snaked up my spine. I let go of the handle and took a step back. "Can you hear me? I think the door..." "Come in," she insisted, her voice now sharper, almost mocking. I knew she heard me. There was no way she didn't. Was she toying with me? "I need to talk to you, but I'm not coming inside," I said firmly. No answer. Then suddenly, a shadow blocked the peephole's faint light. Someone was watching me. I hadn't even heard her move. I stepped back, pressing myself against the wall opposite the door. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure she could hear it. "I should go," I muttered. "I'm not..." "Come in," the voice came again. This time, it was harsher, more demanding. It wasn't an invitation anymore, it was an order. My skin prickled, and I edged away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. As I reached the stairs, I heard a mechanical click, the unmistakable sound of a lock. I peeked down the stairs and caught a shadowy figure locking the exit door from the outside. Reggie? Before I could think, the front door began to creak open. The woman was coming out. The guide downstairs disappeared into the night without a sound. "Come in," her voice bubbled out, dark and twisted, like someone speaking underwater. I caught a brief glimpse of her, her long, flowing brown hair hiding a face that was wrong. Her skin shimmered, scaly, shifting colors as I stared. Too many eyes scattered across her face, blue, brown, and eerie green, all glimmering in the dim light. It was as if the beautiful woman I'd seen before was fractured and reconstructed into something monstrous. I could have stared forever, caught in horror and fascination, but my body betrayed me. I stumbled backward, losing my balance at the top of the stairs, and I fell. It all happened so fast. One moment I was falling, the next I was on the ground floor, looking up the staircase. Pain radiated from my bruised body, my leg twisted beneath me. Behind me, I felt the cold metal of the locked front door. "Come in," I heard from above, the words repeating like a chant. "Come in, come in, come in." A face appeared around the corner, shifting and rearranging itself, almost like it was putting on a mask. Teeth fell away, only to crumble into dust on the stairs. Her hair darkened to black, skin turning a warm Mediterranean tan. She started to resemble someone I once loved, my first girlfriend. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced myself to turn toward the front door. I heard slow, clumsy footsteps descending the stairs behind me. I pounded on the glass, screaming for help, trying to stand despite the agony in my leg. "Come in," the voice whispered again. Suddenly, I felt warmth, a scent of exotic fruit shampoo, comforting and familiar. A hand brushed against my jacket, gentle but firm. Then, out stepped one of the old men from the bookstore, the beardless one. The footsteps behind me hurried back upstairs, fading into silence. The old man quickly unlocked the door, and I scrambled out, collapsing onto the pavement. My leg wouldn't hold me, so I crawled backward, desperate to put descent between me and that nightmare. He looked at me with concern, confusion etched on his face. Call the police," I stammered, breathless. "Please, do it. Oh God." He pulled out his phone and dialed the emergency number, kneeling beside me and resting a hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay? Did that man do something to you?" he asked. "What?" I whispered, still shaking. The young man by the stairs. Did he hurt you?" I sat there, barely able to move until the police arrived. I told them everything: the attack, the strange apartment on Moray Street, Reggie, the woman in the window. I probably babbled non-stop as they led me to their squad car. The bookstore owner just gave me a sad, apologetic look, then gave a brief statement to the officers. But the police? I don't think they did a damn thing. They found nothing. Some said no one lives there. Others said the place was empty or just storage. No one gave me a straight answer. It felt like they wanted to write it off as hysteria. I keep thinking about Reggie. I think something terrible happened to him. Maybe he lost himself to whatever lives in that apartment. And sometimes, when I'm near that corner store, I look up at that window. Sometimes, I swear I see something there. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think it's watching me back. Hey, I want to share something pretty personal with you. Something that's been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I'm a 35-year-old guy, served in the Navy for 8 years, and I've always had these really strange, almost freaky things happen while I'm sleeping. It started when I was just a little kid, like between 3 and 5 years old. I remember this big old football hanging on the wall in my childhood bedroom. It wasn't just decoration, it had hooks for backpacks and jackets. My earliest dream memory is a repeating one, and it was always the same. I'd be standing at the end of the hallway, looking down towards that football, and there would be this figure just standing there. It never noticed me, but I noticed it. I didn't know what it was, just a shadowy, silent presence. And that dream kept coming back over and over. Fast forward a bit. We moved to a new city when I was in 2nd grade, into this really old house. Within the first week, I had my first experience with sleep paralysis. It was terrifying. I was lying in bed and I couldn't move a muscle. It felt like something was pressing down on me, holding me to the mattress. I tried to scream for my parents, but no sound came out. I was completely paralyzed and trapped in this nightmare state. I've never told anyone that before. It's the first time I'm sharing it now. Then, when I was between 10 and 12, my grandmother passed away. Now, she was a woman who really didn't like me, and honestly, I didn't like her much either. But a few months after she died, she showed up in a dream. It was so vivid and strange. She appeared in black and white, while the rest of the dream was in color. She looked dead, with black eyes and tattered clothes, but around her was this weird, glittery rainbow glow. She looked right at me and told me she was okay with it, like she was at peace. Then she picked up this dog, and I woke up. The next day, something bizarre happened. That dog she had in the dream, this really mean, aggressive dog we'd adopted, just vanished. Poof, gone without a trace. Not long after that, my grandpa announced he was getting remarried. The night before the wedding, we were all sitting around the table playing dice, a game called 750, late into the night. Grandpa asked my dad, his son, if he thought Grandma would be okay with the remarriage. Without thinking, I just blurted out, "Yes, she said she's happy with it." I didn't even realize I'd said it until the words were already out there. My time in the Navy brought more strange dreams. I kept seeing people without faces, just empty spaces where their faces should be. But it wasn't just random. I felt like I knew these faceless figures. Some showed up again and again. When I woke up, I had this overwhelming urge to find them, like I'd lost a sibling and my mom was telling me to go search. The feeling was gut-wrenching. To me, they felt real, like they needed help, but they had no faces and left no clues. I'd be on edge all the time, trying to sense their presence, like you can sometimes feel when someone's angry or sad. But this was different, just their silent presence. After 8 years in the Navy, I got out in 2012, and then things took a darker turn. Demons started showing up in my dreams. One dream was split screen, like something out of a video game. On one side was my grandpa, Mom's dad, and on the other was this massive black figure. It had a body, arms, and smoke for legs, with a huge head and 3 glowing red eyes arranged in a triangle. It was like it was trying to show me something. Grandpa's health has declined, and he's got severe dementia now, so this dream hit me hard. In 2017, I had a dream where an actual demon crawled out of me. It was climbing the walls, tearing apart my house. It was furious, evil, and filled with rage. I could feel it wanting to rip me apart. That demon has shown up a few more times since then, always showing me awful, terrifying things. Visions of death, burning, and torture involving my wife and daughters. It's more than anyone should have to witness, especially a dad, and it happens 2 or 3 times a month. And now, 2 days ago, it went too far. Sometimes I sleep on the couch because my daughters, who are around 3 and 4, might sneak into bed and hog the covers with their mom. So I just say forget it and crash on the big couch. That night, I dreamed of this tall, skinny shadow figure. It held me down and beat me mercilessly, choking me, scratching me. I could feel all its hate and rage. When I woke up, I was trapped, barely able to breathe, unable to move or exhale. I swear I could still feel it in the room, smell it even. It was real. I got up and went outside to smoke half a joint. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare. But the demon came back, this time torturing my family. I kept hearing the name Tom echoed in this diabolical laughter as I watched everything unfold. Then it turned back to me, and I jolted awake, terrified. And now, just 2 days later, out of nowhere, my wife sat me down and asked for a divorce. No warning, no build-up, just out of the blue. It feels like everything is unraveling, and honestly, I'm about done with all this nightmare nonsense. It's 1:30 a.m. here in Texas, and here I am, a 35-year-old Navy veteran, terrified to go back to sleep. Am I losing my mind? Or is this stuff actually happening? I don't know what to think anymore. All I know is that if you've ever felt like something's lurking just beyond the edge of your dreams, you're not alone. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't in the dark. They're inside our own minds, refusing to let us rest. I was 18 when this happened, and honestly, I still don't know exactly what we encountered. One night, I went ghost hunting with 3 friends. I'd done it a few times before, so I wasn't completely new to it, but I definitely wasn't an expert. My friend Rowan was the serious investigator of the group. He owned a spirit box, a thermal camera, audio recorders, all of it. Our other 2 friends, Kayla and Devin, had never been ghost hunting before. The group was split pretty evenly. 2 of us believed in the paranormal, and the other 2 were skeptical. Kayla suggested an old cemetery a few minutes from her house. We lived in southern Utah, near several historic settlements and native lands, so the whole area already carried a lot of history. When we arrived, Rowan and I set up the equipment while everyone else looked around. We eventually settled near the oldest section of the cemetery, where the headstones were worn and uneven. Kayla volunteered to try the Estes method. For anyone unfamiliar with it, She wore noise-blocking headphones connected to the spirit box and called out whatever words she heard, while the rest of us asked questions she couldn't hear. Nothing dramatic happened at first. Kayla said she felt something touch her arm a few times, and we received a handful of vague answers, but nothing that felt undeniable. Rowan noticed several cold spots near the back of the cemetery, though, so we decided to investigate that area next. Before we moved, Devin started joking about skinwalkers. Because of my native background, I immediately asked him to stop. I told him that I didn't want to treat native beliefs or traditions like a ghost story punchline. He apologized, and we dropped the subject. At least, I thought we did. The back of the cemetery was quieter. There were fewer graves, more trees, and an old historical home nearby. Devin put on the headphones for the Estes method, while Rowan tested his thermal camera. Kayla held the flashlight, and I asked most of the questions. The responses Devin repeated were disturbing, but they didn't form a clear conversation. Shoot. Death. Kill. Then, every few minutes, Devin would say one word. Skin. The first couple of times, we ignored it. Spirit boxes produce plenty of random sounds, so we tried not to force meaning onto anything. But he kept saying it. Skin. 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 He must have repeated it 6 or 7 times. The other messages were strangely contradictory. One moment, Devin would say, "Run," or "Go away." A few minutes later, he would say, "Stay." Then, "Stay here." At one point, he suddenly said, "Behind." I asked, "Behind who? Behind Devin?" He answered, "To the left." We all turned, but there was nothing there. After that, the words became scattered again. More references to death. More talk about shooting. I was leaning against a tree when Devin said, "Skin," one more time. I was already nervous, so I looked at Kayla and tried to laugh it off. I really hope I'm not connecting the dots I think I'm connecting. The spirit box immediately gave Devin another word. Yes. It was so clear that my stomach dropped. I moved closer to Kayla. Neither of us said much after that. About a minute later, Rowan pointed his thermal camera toward the trees on our right. Then a branch snapped directly in front of us. It didn't sound like something falling. It sounded like a foot stepping down on a dry twig. The 3 of us reacted instantly. We pulled Devin's headphones off, grabbed whatever equipment we could carry, and ran back toward the parking lot. Once we reached the cars, Rowan began cleansing everyone with sage. That was when Devin looked at me and said something that made the whole situation worse. Every time I said skin, I was hearing the full word skinwalker. I just didn't say it because you told me not to. Kayla and I stared at each other. Neither of us felt like joking anymore. We packed everything and left. I drove everyone home, dropping Rowan off last because he lived in the next town. During the drive, Kayla messaged us. She had been researching the nearby historical site and discovered that the area had a long and complicated history involving native communities. That made me feel even worse. I started wondering whether we had entered a place we didn't understand and disturbed something we had no business disturbing. Rowan and I talked about it during the drive, trying to sound calm. We were both nervous, but we kept telling ourselves that fear could make ordinary things feel meaningful. After I dropped him off, I drove home alone. I had quiet piano music playing in the car. The road was nearly empty. Then I heard a voice. It came from directly behind me, close to my left ear. I couldn't understand what it said, but it was unmistakably a voice. I screamed so loudly that I almost swerved. There was nobody in the back seat. My music didn't have vocals. My phone wasn't playing anything else. I immediately called Rowan and kept him on the phone until I reached another friend's house. I stayed there until sunrise because I couldn't bring myself to be alone. For the next few days, I barely slept. I stayed with friends whenever possible and avoided being alone at night. Then my stepmother saw something outside my room. She's deeply religious and has experienced things she considers paranormal, although she doesn't describe herself as psychic. She told me that around 11 one night, she walked downstairs and looked toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. Something was standing outside my door. She said it didn't enter. It was simply waiting. That terrified me because I had already felt watched. Until then, I could tell myself it was anxiety, exhaustion, or my imagination. Hearing that someone else had noticed something made it harder to dismiss. My friends began having experiences too. Rowan had dealt with strange activity in his house before, but soon after the cemetery visit, he sent me a video of repeated knocking on his bedroom door when nobody was outside. Kayla started cleansing her room constantly. A few days later, she told me she saw a tall figure enter her room and disappear. Since that night, all of us have felt uneasy in different ways. For me, nighttime is the worst. I feel a heavy sense of dread, especially when I leave my room. I know fear can feed itself, and I know that once you expect something frightening, every sound starts to feel significant. Still, the feeling has been difficult to shake. I've cleansed my room, burned cedar, prayed, and placed a picture of Jesus near my door. Whether those things are protecting me spiritually or simply helping me feel safer, I'm grateful for the comfort. The hardest part is knowing that we chose to go there. We understood that ghost hunting could frighten us or make us feel like we had brought something home. We went anyway. We treated a place with real history and real human remains like an experiment. Now I can't stop wondering whether something followed us, or whether fear followed us and took on a life of its own. I've researched skinwalker stories, but I also know those traditions are often misunderstood and sensationalized by outsiders. I don't want to claim that's what this was, especially when I have no real proof. Maybe it was a spirit trying to scare us. Maybe the spirit box created random words that our minds connected into a story. Maybe all four of us frightened one another so badly that every strange event afterward felt related. Or maybe we encountered something we still don't understand. Whatever it was, I don't plan on returning to that cemetery. And I definitely won't be treating places like that as entertainment again. I still remember this like it happened last week. It was the summer of 2001, and I was upstairs in my bedroom playing Diablo 2 on the family computer. Back then, I didn't have some fancy gaming chair. It was just a regular old office chair, the kind that squeaked if you leaned too far back. While I was waiting for the game to load, I kept rocking in that chair, leaning back and letting it creak a little. And when I rocked back one time, I saw a woman walking down the stairs. My room was positioned in a way where I had a clear view of the top of the staircase. I could see her standing there for a second, looking down like she was about to descend, and then I watched her go down step by step between the bars of the banister. She looked completely normal. She wasn't glowing, she wasn't see-through, she didn't float. The room didn't turn cold. Nothing dramatic happened. She was dressed like a typical suburban mom from the 80s or 90s. Nothing flashy. Maybe a sweatshirt, maybe mom jeans or sweatpants. Just modest, everyday clothes. And I could hear her footsteps on the stairs. That's probably why I didn't panic right away. People stopped by our house now and then. Friends of my mom's, church people, PTA parents, neighbors dropping things off. It wasn't unusual for someone to be there. Our house only had one bathroom, and it was at the bottom of the stairs. Some houses in our neighborhood had the bathroom upstairs, but ours was downstairs, close to the staircase. So I just assumed this woman was someone my mom knew, and maybe she was looking for the bathroom. I stood up from my chair, leaned over the railing and called out, "Ma'am, the bathroom is right." But nobody was there. I went downstairs. The bathroom door was open. Nobody was inside. I looked toward the living room and could see the front door. It was closed and locked with the deadbolt. Then I went toward the back of the house. That door was closed too, though it wasn't locked. Outside, my mom was on the deck moving patio furniture around because we were supposed to have people over in a few days. I asked her, "Did your friend find the bathroom?" She looked at me and said, "What friend?" "We're the only ones here." So I told her what I saw. The two of us searched the house together. Every room, every corner, everywhere someone could have gone. We didn't find anyone. And then, just like that, the moment passed. My mom asked me to help her outside with the yard, and we never really talked about it again. I was in my late teens at the time, so part of me wonders if she thought I had just scared myself playing a creepy game alone upstairs. Or maybe she'd had some kind of strange experience in that house too, and she simply didn't want to discuss it. I honestly don't know. Years later, I told that story at a college party when everyone was swapping ghost stories. Some people laughed it off. Some were interested. Some just enjoyed the weirdness of it. But one girl, named Kara, got really quiet. She seemed more disturbed than anyone else. I tried to reassure her. I told her I never felt threatened. I never saw that woman again. Nothing else happened in that house before or after. And then Kara said something I've never forgotten. She said, "I really hope it was a ghost." Then she told us about an older man in her family, maybe her grandfather or great-uncle, who had started mentally slipping when she was younger. He would wander away from home and walk into other people's houses without realizing what he was doing. Sometimes they were houses he used to know. Sometimes they belonged to old friends or relatives. Sometimes they were just random homes. People would find him sitting at a kitchen table, reading a book, organizing a pantry, or tinkering with things in a garage like he belonged there. The homeowners would panic, call the police, and eventually someone from his family would come get him. But one time, a woman found him hiding in a closet. She thought he had broken in and was waiting there to hurt her after she went to sleep. But he said he thought the house was being robbed and that he was hiding from the burglar. In his mind, he was a child again, hiding in the house he grew up in. That's when the whole situation became much more serious. And after Kara told that story, my own experience felt different. Because a ghost is scary, sure. It's strange and unsettling. But the idea that some real woman might have been walking through my house, maybe noticing my mom was outside and distracted, and then slipping away quietly when she heard my game or the squeak of my chair upstairs, that possibility bothers me a lot more. I still remember the week we moved into that old rental house in Ottawa. The kids were tiny then, so my parents kept them for a few days while my husband and I tried to clean the place, unpack boxes, and make it feel like home. At first, nothing seemed especially strange. The house was a little worn down, sure, but not unusual. Except for the kitchen. Every time I went in there, I felt this awful heaviness. Not just discomfort, but dread. Like the air had gone thick around me. I kept brushing it off because we had too much to do, and honestly, I didn't want to scare myself before we'd even finished unpacking. While I was sorting through clothes in the bedroom, I found this ridiculous navy coverall my husband had gotten years earlier as a joke gift. I didn't know what else to do with it, so I tossed it up onto the top shelf at the back of the closet. It fell right back down. I thought I'd thrown it badly, so I picked it up and tossed it again. It came back out. At that point, I rolled it tightly into a ball and shoved it as far back as I could. Then I walked down the hall to tell my husband, who was in the kitchen, that apparently the house was already rejecting our belongings. When I came back into the bedroom, I stopped cold. That coverall was lying flat across the bed, fully spread out, sleeves straight, legs straight, like someone had carefully arranged it there. The bed was several feet away from the closet. I can still remember the way my stomach dropped. Every hair on my body stood up. I felt sick. My husband tried to talk me down and said maybe I'd put it there without realizing, or maybe it had somehow fallen and opened up on the bed. I wanted to believe that, so I did. I went back to work, unpacking bathroom boxes and fixing the messy caulking around the tub. By the time I finished, I was exhausted. My husband and I sat down in the living room for a break. The moment I sat on the couch, the cushion under me shifted. Not a little settling movement. It felt like something moved beneath me. I jumped up, and my husband told me gently that I was probably tired, and maybe the smell from the caulk was getting to me. That made enough sense, so I tried to laugh it off and sat down again. This time, something jabbed me hard from underneath. It felt exactly like a hand pushing up into me. I yelped and shot off the couch. We actually started wondering if a mouse or rat had somehow gotten in during the move. We left the house, bought traps, checked everywhere, and found nothing. 2 days later, we brought the kids home. That was when things got worse. Our 5-year-old son suddenly couldn't sleep. He kept telling us that every time he closed his eyes, he saw fire. Not a small fire. He said it was everywhere. Endless flames. And there was a man standing inside them. That scared me more than I wanted to admit, but we tried to keep life normal. Then my husband and I started experiencing something strange too. When we were falling asleep, or just waking up, we'd see these horrible flashes in our minds. Violent images. Death. Pain. Things neither of us had ever experienced before. It always happened in that strange in-between place, right before sleep or right after waking. It got to the point where I dreaded closing my eyes. But the worst night was with our daughter. She was 2, and I woke up to her crying in a way I knew wasn't normal. It wasn't a fussy cry or a tired cry. It was the kind of cry that means something is very wrong. I ran into her room. Above her crib, near the little paper bird mobile, there was a dark shape blocking the glow from the nightlight. It wasn't just a shadow in the corner. It was hanging there, dense and still, like a patch of darkness had gathered itself over her bed. I grabbed my daughter out of the crib immediately. The mobile was usually turning slightly because the room always had a faint draft. But that night, it was perfectly still. I blew a strong breath toward it, expecting the paper birds to move. They didn't. The shadow didn't move either. It was like my breath hit a wall. I was terrified, but more than that, I was furious. Whatever was happening, it was bothering my children, and something in me just snapped. I stood there holding my daughter and said, very firmly, "No, that's enough." Then I took her back to our room and put her in our bed. After that, I went and got my son too. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My husband didn't see the shadow himself, but he saw me afterward, and I think that frightened him almost as much. Oddly, things calmed down after we adopted a rescue cat. The strange incidents became less frequent, almost like the house pulled back a little, but that heavy feeling in the kitchen never really went away. We left when the lease ended. And the strangest part is this: neither my husband nor I have experienced anything like that before or since. I worked for the DWP for about 7 years, quite a while back now. And one of the buildings I was based in was Dutch's house in Birmingham. I honestly couldn't tell you if it's still standing these days, but I remember that place very clearly. While I was there, I got quite friendly with some of the security staff. One of them, a lovely bloke called Les, used to tell me all sorts of stories about the building. He's no longer with us now, bless him, but some of the things he told me have stayed with me ever since. Because it was a government building, it didn't just shut up at 5 o'clock. There were people working late, sometimes until 10 at night, and once the last person had left, security had to do a full sweep of the place. They'd check every floor, lock the main doors, and then go through the car park before finally closing everything down properly. One night, Les and another guard, I think his name was Stan, had gone through the whole building. Every floor had been checked, every office was empty, and they were certain there wasn't a soul left inside. They were walking through the car park with their torches, with a bit of light coming in from the street lamps, when they suddenly heard banging from somewhere above them. They looked up at the building, and there, on one of the upper floors, was a woman. Not a shadow, not a reflection. A woman, plain as anything, standing at the window and knocking on the glass. Both of them saw her. Straight away they thought, how on earth did we miss her? They assumed she must have been in the toilets or tucked away somewhere when they checked that floor. So they went back inside. Les stayed down at the front desk, and Stan went up to the floor where they'd seen her. He unlocked the doors and started checking around. About half an hour later, he came back down to reception on his own, looking completely confused. He said he'd checked that floor and the floors above and below it, and there was nobody there. No woman, no staff member, nothing. Then he asked Les, "Has anyone come through the front entrance?" Les told him no. Nobody had come out. Nobody had passed the desk. They ended up having to ring the site manager, who was not happy at all. Apparently, he accused them of drinking on the job, which they absolutely hadn't been. But they both knew what they'd seen. And that wasn't the only strange thing that happened there. Another time, 2 security lads were sent to fit a new CCTV camera in one of the alleyways beside the building. They took a ladder, the camera, a drill, and all the bits they needed. The guards at the main desk could see them on another camera further up the alley, so they were watching them while they worked. Now the strange thing was, these 2 were taking ages to get the camera fitted. Every now and then, they'd stop what they were doing and look behind them, as if someone was standing there talking to them. Eventually, they came back to the main desk, and the guards there started teasing them. You know, saying things like, "How many security guards does it take to put up one camera?" But the 2 who'd been outside didn't laugh. They got annoyed and said, "We would have had it done in 10 minutes if it wasn't for that kid asking us question after question." The guards at the desk just looked at them. What kid? They said there'd been a little boy in the alley with them, asking what they were doing, why they were putting that thing on the wall, and all sorts of curious little questions. The 2 guards at the front desk went quiet, then told them they'd been watching the alley on CCTV the whole time. There had been no child there. Not once. They showed them the footage, and sure enough, the 2 men were standing there, turning around and talking to empty space. One of those camera fitters quit that same day. The other one later said the boy had looked old-fashioned, wearing a little flat cap, a shirt, and shorts, almost like something out of another time. And honestly, after hearing stories like that, I never looked at that building the same way again. I'd been offered a place for a small business, and the rent was honestly too good to ignore. The catch was the upstairs area. It was in rough shape and needed a lot of work. The building itself was an old bank, built sometime between the First and Second World Wars. Upstairs had originally been a small apartment for the bank manager and his family. For its time, I imagine it would have been pretty lovely. By the time I got there, though, it was tired, dusty, and badly in need of being brought back to life. Downstairs was a wellness salon, so I couldn't do any noisy renovation during the day. That meant I'd finish my regular job, head over there in the evening, and work from around 7 at night until midnight. I was so determined to get it finished that I didn't really think about how eerie the place was. I was sourcing old timber, copying the original skirting boards and trim, trying to make everything look like it belonged to the building again. I was completely absorbed in it. There was a hallway outside the rooms upstairs, and the floorboards had this very distinct squeak when someone walked past. It was the kind of sound you recognize immediately. One night, while I was working, I heard that squeak. At first, I barely reacted. Then I stopped and realized what time it was. It was late, and I was supposed to be alone. Then it hit me that I'd heard that same squeak a few times before on other nights, but I'd been too focused to really register it. So I went out into the hall and looked around. There was nobody there. My first thought wasn't ghosts or anything like that. It was a real person, someone hiding in the building. So I grabbed a hammer, went downstairs, checked the doors and windows, and made sure everything was locked. Most of the downstairs area was alarmed anyway, and everything seemed fine. I went back upstairs and kept working. A little while later, the hallway floor squeaked again. This time I went out quickly, and just after that I heard a dull little click or clank from the old bathroom at the end of the hall. Without thinking too much, I walked straight down there to see who was inside. It was a big old bathroom with a pale green porcelain bathtub and matching sink. Very dated, very still. There was no one in there, and there was no other way in or out. I wouldn't say I was terrified in the moment, but I'd had enough for the night. I tidied up quickly, packed my things, and left. After that, the noises kept happening now and then. Nothing dramatic, just random sounds. The hall squeaking. The occasional strange noise from another room. A couple of times the lights flickered. Looking back, I also remember tools turning up in odd places, almost like someone had hidden them somewhere silly just to annoy me. At the time, I brushed most of it off. I just wanted the renovation done. When I finally finished, the upstairs looked really good. I was proud of it. I invited some of the staff from downstairs to come up and have a look. They were hairdressers, massage therapists, beauty therapists, that sort of thing. All women. A couple of them mentioned they hadn't been upstairs in years. Then one of them said something like, "The energy doesn't feel as bad up here now." That stuck with me. Later that week, I was downstairs and asked one of the staff what she meant by that. That's when she told me more about the place. Apparently, when the hair studio used to be upstairs, all sorts of things had happened after hours. People felt invisible hands touch them. Trolleys moved on their own. Voices came from the corners of empty rooms. None of the staff liked being up there, especially alone. And that was the part that made everything feel different. Because when I'd been working there late at night, I hadn't known any of that. I hadn't known the building had that kind of reputation. I honestly think if someone had told me beforehand, I would have been out of there the first time I heard that hallway squeak. I ended up using that premises for 3 years. Over that time, other people mentioned feeling uneasy in certain parts of the building. A friend of mine, Callum, said he was sure he saw something in the hallway once. He wasn't the type to exaggerate either. He said it quietly, like he didn't even really want to believe it himself. In the last few months I was there, the downstairs salon moved out, so I had the whole building to myself. I never saw anything clearly, but there were a few nights when I'd get this sudden feeling that I wasn't alone, and that it was probably time to leave. So I did. I learned to trust that feeling. There was one more strange thing that happened after all of this. I had a chance encounter with a woman who claimed to have psychic ability. I hadn't told her about the building in any detail, but she described it to me exactly. Not just generally either. She mentioned details only I would have known because of the renovation work I'd done there. She told me the place was very active. According to her, There were two spirits around while I was working. One was female, and she was apparently very interested in me. She followed me around and tried to get my attention by playing little tricks, moving tools, making sounds, that kind of thing. The other was male. She said he wasn't as interested, but he would check in from time to time. I don't know what to make of all that, but I do know she described the place far too accurately for comfort. And here's the last odd part. I left that building more than 5 years ago, and since then it's stayed vacant, even though it's in a valuable rental location. That never made much sense to me. The truth is, the place never felt quite right from the start. I only took it because the rent was cheap. At the time, I thought I was just renovating an old bank apartment after hours. Looking back, I think something was there with me most nights. And I'm very glad I didn't know that while I was holding a hammer in an empty hallway at midnight. I still think about this sometimes, and honestly, it still gives me that strange little chill. This was about 23 years ago, back when my mother and I both smoked cigarettes. We never smoked inside the house, especially with the kids there, so after everyone was tucked in for the night, we had this little ritual. We called it our goodnight cigarette. We would sit out on the front porch in the dark, talking quietly and letting the day fade out. We almost never turned the porch light on because we lived in the South, and once that light came on, every bug in 3 counties showed up like it had been personally invited. Our house sat at the very end of a dead-end road with a huge open field beside it. One night, while we were sitting there, we saw 3 women walking along the edge of that field. They were dressed in old-fashioned antebellum dresses. One of them was carrying a basket. They didn't look transparent exactly. They looked solid enough that, for a second, my mind tried to make them real. But somehow, at the same time, we both knew they weren't. They walked straight into the field like they belonged there. The funny part is, my mother and I just froze. We were sitting there with cigarettes in our hands, not even smoking them anymore, just holding them like 2 porch statues. Then my mother finally said, very quietly, "Did you see that?" And I said, "Yes." We were both pretty shaken, but also completely fascinated. Years later, we got what felt like our first little piece of validation. A new neighbor moved in, a retired Marine officer who had come back to town to help care for his mother. While we were talking with him, he mentioned that when he was a boy, that field hadn't always been just a field. He said the entrance to it used to lead to an old plantation house. That stopped me cold. Then, even later, one of my daughters was grown and working as a hairstylist. A client of hers, who just happened to live in our neighborhood, told her that she and a friend had seen women in antebellum dresses walking through their backyard. My daughter immediately said, "My mom and grandma saw them too." I can't explain how relieved we all felt. Not because it made it less strange, but because it made us feel less alone in what we had seen. There was another time, when my youngest was only about 2. She used to come with me in the mornings when I took the older kids to school. One cold morning, there was frost on the ground, and she was standing near the back field, giggling and waving at something. I told her to come on, but she just kept waving. Then she said, "Mama, look. They don't have shirts on." I ran over and looked, but I didn't see anything at all. When we got back home, I asked her what they had been doing. Since she was only 2, it took a while to get the whole story out of her, but she said there were people standing around a fire. She said there was a dog there too. One of them noticed her and pointed, and then they all turned and smiled and waved back at her. She said they had long hair, and one man was sitting on a log with long white hair. She wasn't scared at all. From the way she described it, they felt friendly to her. Then she mentioned something that really stayed with me. She said they had feathers pointing down along the side of their faces, Now, I'm no expert, but my oldest daughter's father is Native American, and his family lived on a reservation, so I had heard a little here and there. But I had never heard of that specific kind of headdress. So of course, I went looking. And wouldn't you know it, the tribe connected to that area had the name of a neighboring town, and in the images I found, they wore feathers pointing downward along the side of the face. That one still sits with me. The last thing is something we all believe is residual. It doesn't feel like a person or a spirit trying to interact. It's more like a shadow or an echo. It looks like a very large bear. He comes out of one wall in the living room, crosses the room, and disappears into the next wall, just minding his own business. He's never threatening, never even interested in us. He just strolls through. It happens maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and it has been going on for more than 25 years. The kids used to call him Big Brother Bear because of the movie. And the strangest part is, when he appears, everyone can see him. Even people who don't believe in any of this. He just walks through the room like he has somewhere else to be. And honestly, at this point, he feels like part of the house. I was 15 when I ran away from home, and later that same year, I ended up in a group home for runaway girls. Most of us were teenagers, somewhere between 13 and 17. Every now and then, younger kids would stay with us for a short time, maybe a week or 2, depending on their situation. When this happened, there were 4 of us girls there, me, another girl who was 16, and 2 girls who were 17. There were also 2 adult staff members on duty. Then one day, they brought in a little girl. She was only 11. She'd been removed from her family, and I'll call her Susie. She was quiet, sweet, really. The kind of kid who didn't take up much space, and because she was so young, all of us felt protective of her in our own rough teenage way. So whenever we did something, we tried to include her. She'd been there about a week when, one night, we were all bored and decided to mess around with a Ouija board. At first, it was silly, just teenage nonsense. Questions like, does so-and-so have a crush on this person? Or, is my dead grandmother here? And then somebody would say, okay, prove it. Say something only she would know. Then one of us asked if there were any spirits or ghosts in the room. The board said yes. So we asked who the spirit wanted to talk to. It spelled out the first couple letters of Susie's name. And then it stopped. We tried asking more questions, but after that, it didn't feel like anything was moving anymore. So we quit using the board. Then one of the girls told Susie to lie down on the floor so we could try something else. Susie did it. She laid flat on her back, and we turned off the lights, lit a candle, and started chanting. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Nothing happened. Then another girl said something like, Spirit, come through this candle and speak to us. And I swear, the candle flickered. Right after that, Susie got this strange look on her face and said, very softly, no. That was the first moment I felt something in my stomach twist. I remember thinking, maybe we should stop. But the older girls were kind of leading everything, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin it, so I stayed quiet. Then someone asked, Spirit, what do you want to tell us? A couple of the girls giggled, and then Susie said, in this flat, empty voice, don't let the dead in. The whole room changed. I know that sounds dramatic, but it really did. The joking stopped. The air felt heavier. Someone laughed in that nervous way people do when they're scared but don't want to admit it. One of the 17-year-olds finally said, okay, this is stupid, and blew the candle out. And that's when it started. Susie began trembling, then shaking, then violently shaking. At first, we thought she was messing around. We were saying things like, come on, very funny, get up. but her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, and she wasn't responding to us. Then she started flailing her arms. All four of us crowded around her, trying to keep her still, but we couldn't. She was twisting, kicking, jerking, and moving with this strength that did not make sense for an 11-year-old girl. Someone yelled for help, and the two staff members came running in. They asked what was going on, and we told them the truth. We had been playing with a Ouija board, and then she just started shaking. The staff called her name, loudly. They grabbed her arms and asked if she was okay. Nothing. Then they started yelling at her, telling her to knock it off or she'd be in trouble. Still nothing. And then she got worse. She shook harder. 6 of us were trying to hold her down, 4 teenage girls and 2 grown adults. And we could not do it. She threw some of us off like it was nothing. Then she got up onto all fours, still shaking, making this horrible guttural sound. She was knocking things over, swinging her arms, kicking out. We kept trying to grab her, but she kept breaking free. She was 11, just 11 years old. Finally, one of the girls was almost crying and shouted, "Tell us how to help you. Please, how do we help you?" And Susie answered. Her voice sounded exhausted, strained, almost strangled. She said, "You have to take the candle, light it, tell the spirit to leave, wish it well, and then blow it out." I still remember the way she emphasized certain words. Take, light, tell, wish. Then, she was still shaking while she said it. People were still trying to hold her down. So someone grabbed the candle, lit it, and said something like, "Spirit, leave this child. We wish you well." Then they blew it out. And Susie just collapsed. She dropped onto the floor, drenched in cold sweat. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We just stood there stunned. Then one of the staff members said, very quietly, "Everyone go to your rooms. Go to bed. Susie, come with me." I don't remember much after that. What I do remember is the way the staff acted for the next couple of days. They were usually upbeat with us, even when things were messy. Even when someone got bad news, or there was a fight, or somebody was crying, they tried to keep the mood steady. But after that night, they were different. Subdued, careful, almost scared. And that, more than anything, told me that something had shaken them too. I know people can explain a lot of this away. Fear, hysteria, kids getting carried away, all of that. I understand that. But I still cannot explain her strength. Susie was a normal-sized 11-year-old girl. She wasn't big. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't the kind of kid who would pull a prank or try to scare everyone. She was quiet and mild and sweet. And 6 people, including 2 adults, could not hold her down. I still think about that night sometimes. And every time I do, it creeps right back under my skin. I want to tell you about a few experiences that have stayed with me because they never really felt random. About a year after my grandfather passed away, we moved my grandmother out of the house they had shared for so long and into a smaller place. That old house had been the center of everything for our family. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, all of it lived there, in the walls. One night, I woke up out of nowhere. My eyes just snapped open. The room was dark and quiet, and when I looked to my right, my grandfather was standing there. It scared me, of course. How could it not? But at the same time, I didn't want to blink. I had this feeling that if I closed my eyes, even for a second, he would disappear. So I just stared at him for as long as I could. I wasn't planning to tell anyone. I figured people would think I had dreamed it or imagined it. But the next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when my mom came downstairs. We were having a normal morning conversation, nothing unusual, and then she suddenly said, "I think my dad came to see me last night." That stopped me cold. To me, that felt like confirmation. I really believed my grandfather was coming to say goodbye, especially because we weren't going to be going back to that old family house anymore. I've only seen him one other time since then, and that was almost 10 years ago. My grandmother passed this year, and part of me feels like maybe I won't see him again. But honestly, who knows? Another time, I went on a trip with some friends to a cabin none of us had ever stayed in before. It belonged to a family friend of one of my friends. The cabin itself seemed peaceful enough. Nothing felt especially creepy, other than the usual, "we're deep in the woods in Michigan" kind of feeling. We had a good day, hung out, laughed, ate, and eventually went to bed. Then, once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. But this time, it was different. It felt like I was sitting on top of the tall dresser across from the bed, looking down at myself sleeping. My friend was asleep on the top bunk above me. To my left, there was this darkness. Not just a shadow, but a deep, heavy blackness. Slowly, it started forming into what I would now call the Shadow Man. I've heard other people describe the same thing since then. He was tall, completely blacked out, but I could make out a tall hat, broad shoulders, and then the shape just dropped straight down. It was awful. I kept telling myself, "Do not turn around." With my grandfather, I wanted to look. I wanted to see him. With this thing, I absolutely did not. The next morning, our friends were asking how everyone slept. The friend who shared my room said she slept fine. But then my other friend, Dawn, started talking about what happened in her room. Her room was down the hall, and the closet in her room shared a wall with another friend's room. That matters. Dawn said she had been reading with the side table lamp on, and everything felt normal at first. Then the corner of the room near the closet got extremely dark. She said it was pitch black and felt heavy, almost threatening. Then our third friend, Sibel, said she had been hearing knocking from the wall to her left, which was the same wall connected to Dawn's closet. It wasn't constant, but it happened enough that she barely slept. Dawn said that when the blackness in her room wouldn't go away, she pulled the covers over herself and said, "Whoever you are, you're not welcome here. Go away." Not long after that, it disappeared. That's when I told her what happened to me. I honestly think whatever was in her room left and came into mine. The next night, all of us slept together in the living room. Now I live in a 100-year-old house in Detroit, and this house has its own little cast of characters. There's an older man in the basement. I've seen him a few times. He gives off grumpy energy, not evil or dangerous, just very much like, "This is my space, and I don't want people in it." After I saw him a couple of times, I finally said out loud, "I'll respect you as long as you respect me." And honestly, we've been fine for about 5 years. I still hear him sometimes. I've heard a man's voice speaking down in the basement, and there have been times when I'm coming up the basement stairs and I hear 2 sets of footsteps, mine and someone else's. Almost a year after I moved in, my neighbor across the street told me that an older man named Mitchell had died in the basement. So there's that. There's also a little girl in the house. I've seen her twice. She has that restless kid energy. She moves things, hides things, and I've heard her running down the hallway. I think she likes my bedroom because I get the feeling she spends time in there. One night, I was lying in bed and heard a child singing. Then I felt something come up beside the bed. It touched my leg, and then a small hand wrapped around my ankle. I pulled my leg back so fast and said, "You are not allowed to touch me." She hasn't touched me since. but she still tests my patience with noises, missing objects, and little tricks around the house. The third presence feels different. I think it's residual. It's a woman who walks the same path through the living room, over and over, like she's caught in a loop. I think Mitchell was probably already part of the house before I got here. As for the little girl and the woman, I'm not sure. I collect antiques, so there's always the chance they were already here, or that I brought something home with me. My sister says I need to stop antiquing. I have not stopped. And honestly, I probably won't. I ended up with a haunted bed. And I know that sounds dramatic, but honestly, I got rid of it the morning after I brought it into the house. That was all the time I needed. One night, that was enough. There was something attached to it. I don't know what else to call it except an imp. Just this nasty little presence that felt wrong in every possible way. It didn't come into my room, thankfully. I had warded the threshold. But it would sit itself in the closest doorway, right there in the hall, and just watch me. All night. At the time, I had a little love seat in my room too. So after a while, I gave up on the bed and moved over there, thinking maybe I could at least get a little rest. But whatever this thing was, it didn't like that. I could feel the shift immediately. It turned itself somehow, just enough so it could still see me from the hallway. That was the part that really got under my skin. I knew it was stuck out there because I had warded the other doorways in the house too. It couldn't get in, but it didn't have to. It just stayed there, waiting and watching until the sun started coming up. Then it vanished. That next morning, I walked out and told my parents, "We need to get that bed out of here, today." Normally, they would have brushed me off, rolled their eyes, maybe told me I was being ridiculous. But they didn't. Their room was directly across from mine, and they told me they'd both felt uneasy all night, even with their door shut. Like someone was standing outside in the hallway, just waiting. I told them that's because something was. They didn't argue after that. The bed had come from a bedroom set I'd been given when I moved out of this massive old Victorian house where I'd been staying for a while. A girl I knew, Mara, had invited a few of us to live there temporarily. Her family owned the place and had been trying to sell it, but it had been empty for a long time. Winter was coming, so her mother thought it would be smart to have people inside the house to keep an eye on things, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, notice repairs, that kind of thing. What they forgot to mention was that the place was absolutely haunted from top to bottom. And I don't mean one creaky floorboard and a weird draft. I mean the whole house had layers. There was this black mist in the attic that would start drifting down through the ceiling whenever fewer than 3 people were in the house. You did not want to be there alone. Ever. There were cold spots that had nothing to do with the weather. Shadow figures moving where they shouldn't. Voices with no bodies attached to them. There was something in the basement that hated the dark and kept turning the light back on every time we shut it off. After about a week, we just gave up and left it on. There was an old woman in the front upstairs bedroom who liked to stand at the window and stare down at the driveway. There was something else in the crawl space behind the upstairs bathroom that none of us liked talking about. And then there was the little thing attached to my room, which had once been the nursery. I started calling it Harris, mostly because giving it a name made it feel slightly less awful. It liked to stay near my doorway unless the sun was up and the whole house was bright. On rainy days, gray days, dim days, it would show up again. There was also a spirit named Eliza in the house, and I always had the feeling she was working constantly to hold back the darker things. The mist, the shadows, whatever else was pressing in around the edges. So when I moved back home for a bit and took that bedroom set with me, I thought Harris was attached to the house, not the furniture. Turns out, That was a rookie mistake. I can only imagine how unsettling that must have been. Jarring is probably putting it gently. Part of me wonders whether they were trying to help you, in their own strange way, by getting you back to your bed as quickly as possible. But then there's the way they moved, so fast, almost like they were trying not to be seen. Like they knew their presence would frighten anyone who caught a proper look at them. I've had experiences of my own since I was around 12 or 13. One night I was sitting up in bed reading. It wasn't even very late. Then I saw the shape of a very tall man standing beside my wardrobe. Just a dark silhouette, completely still. I remember pulling the duvet right over my head and staying like that until I finally worked up the courage to peek out again. By then, he was gone. Years later, I started looking into the area where we lived and found out other people had seen similar things nearby. Our estate had been built over old coal mining seams, and the more I learned, the more it seemed connected. There was another day when my sister and I were playing, and we both heard a man laughing at us. Clear as anything. Not distant, not faint. Right there. But the strangest thing happened one night when we were playing hide and seek with Dad. It wasn't a large house, so there weren't many places to hide. From the stairs, we saw what looked like a man lying on his side under my cabin bed, propped up on one arm. It looked solid, real. We thought it was Dad, so we shouted that we'd found him, but the figure didn't move. I called out, "Dad?" And Dad answered from downstairs. He said he was watching telly because he was tired out. My sister and I ran straight down. When Dad went to check under the bed, there was nothing there. Whoever or whatever we had seen had vanished. There were other things too, smaller moments that stayed with me. Now I'm in my 40s, and the place I live in has its own atmosphere. I've seen shadow figures here several times. 3 of them looked completely solid in black, but only for a few seconds before disappearing the moment I turned to look properly. Sometimes I've even called out to them, telling them to come forward or speak if they want something. I felt my hair move when no one was near me. I felt the bed dip, like someone had sat down beside me. In the kitchen, I've seen empty bottles wobbling and settling back into place, as if they'd just been spun like coins. There have been sudden freezing patches of air, flickering lights, and orbs that honestly were beautiful in a strange way. But still, nothing quite like what you described. I did some digging into this house and the land around it, around the same time I was researching my childhood home. That's when I found out this place sits directly above an old double coal mining seam. It even explains the slight lean in the house and the subsidence. Then I discovered that 3 miners had died in a fire damp explosion in that very seam. After learning that, something shifted in me. A lot of what happens here seems tied to the mines. Knowing that has actually brought me some peace. Now, when something happens, I usually just greet them. It might be worth looking into what stood where your house is now. Local history archives, reference libraries, and local historians can be absolute treasure chests for that kind of thing. What happened to you sounds frightening, and I do think some spirits, or whatever they are, understand that their appearance scares us. Maybe that's why you were moved so quickly, so they could get you somewhere safe and disappear before you fully saw them. I'll tell you honestly, that is exactly what I've seen in this house. It's usually around the doorways. I'll catch something peering in just for a second, and then it disappears so quickly that I'm left wondering whether I really saw it at all. But I always get the same feeling from it, Not threatening, exactly. More like they're checking on me. At first, though, I was frightened. Properly frightened. There was one evening when I was lying in bed with my cat, and I saw one in the hallway. My cat definitely sees more than I do, by the way. She was already staring before I even looked. This thing was so dark that it covered the white frame of the door behind it. It stayed there for maybe 6 or 7 seconds, which doesn't sound long, but it felt much longer than usual. Most of them vanish almost instantly. I honestly think it thought I was asleep. Then it realized I wasn't, and it was just gone. My cat and I stayed tucked up in bed that night, like two nervous little hedgehogs. After that, I knew I had to start saying something. Whenever I saw something out of the corner of my eye, or felt that strange little shift in the room, I'd say, "I know you're here. Are you going to come and talk to me, or are you just going to keep hovering about?" They never answered. Not in words, anyway. But then I started doing some research into the area, and I found out about the old miners connected to the land here. 3 of them, in particular. Once I learned that, a lot of things began to make sense. I even found their names, and that changed how I felt. I was still cautious, but I wasn't terrified in the same way. So I started greeting them. I say goodnight before I go to sleep, and I tell them everything is all right. I tell them they can stand down now. They're still around. I know they are, but I haven't seen them like that for a long time. I still catch little movements in my peripheral vision, and when I do, I greet them. If I feel that sudden freezing air, I do the same. But they aren't the only ones here, and you'll have to stay with me on this, because this next part isn't about a ghost in the usual human sense. This one is something older, something tied to the earth and to the mining tunnels underneath. I have what people would now call a hob. Years ago, down in the mines, they were often called knockers. The old stories said they would knock inside the tunnels to warn miners if there was danger coming, like a collapse or a bad shift in the ground. Plenty of miners believed in them, and so did many of the widows who were left behind. When the mines closed and the seams flooded, houses were built over the land. Estates like this one. The belief was that some of the knockers moved into the homes and settled near the hearths and fireplaces. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. But the first families who lived around here, especially the old mining families, knew about it. Some would leave a little glass of milk out once a week, on the windowsill or by the hearth, and they'd say something like, "Your milk is there for you." So those smaller shadows I used to see, the ones I sometimes mistook for the cat, I believe that was him. I called him Ben. Every Friday, I leave a little milk for him on the windowsill, and I say, "Good health to you." He still has his habits. He stops the clocks in the sitting room sometimes, and now and again he'll do it in the kitchen too. He's even turned off my electric fan before. From what I understand, beings like him don't care for our human obsession with time. They don't live by it, and they never have. They belong to something older and slower, something rooted deep under our feet. And after I began to understand him, something lovely happened. My back garden became strangely healthy. Things started growing stronger than they had before. Then one day, I noticed a little plant coming up near the window, beside a bush. I didn't know what it was until it flowered. Bluebells. A small patch of them, right there by the house. So now I call him Bluebell Ben. I know there are things in this world that we'll never fully explain. Some are old, much older than us. Some people seem more likely to sense them than others, and maybe I'm one of those people. But I do believe that once you understand who or what might be sharing your space, it helps. It takes some of the fear away. At the same time, I think it's important to set boundaries. You can be respectful and still be firm. You can say what is not allowed. You can tell them when something frightens you or when you need peace. And in my experience, being calm, respectful, and clear makes all the difference. I moved into this little apartment on the 3rd floor, and when I say 3rd floor, I mean that was the end of the line. The stairs didn't go any higher. Each floor had 2 apartments, including mine, so I figured I had one neighbor right next door, and that was that. From inside my place, if I stood near the entryway, I could see the bottom of the stairs by the door next to mine. And pretty quickly after moving in, I started noticing that whoever lived there kept strange hours. Late at night, I'd hear movement. Sometimes it sounded like someone walking around. Other times, it was loud enough that I'd pause whatever I was doing and just listen. I kept running into the other people in the building, but never the person next door. Not once. Still, I told myself they probably worked nights or some kind of shift schedule. That explanation made enough sense, so I let it sit there. After I finally finished unpacking, I needed to put my moving boxes into storage. My rental came with a storage unit in the basement, so I asked a woman downstairs, Mara, where I was supposed to go. She looked a little confused and said, "Since you're on the 3rd floor, you can just use the attic. It's right up there with you. Much easier than dragging everything down." So I went back upstairs and started looking for a ceiling hatch. I checked the hallway, looked around near the stairwell, even stared at the ceiling like it might suddenly blink back at me. But there was nothing. Just my door and the door beside mine. Then I looked closer. My door had a mail slot, my name, and a doorbell. The other door had none of that. No nameplate, no bell, no mail slot. And the handle didn't even look like an apartment lock. It looked like an ordinary indoor door handle. That was the first moment my stomach sank. I stood there for a second, feeling ridiculous, then reached out and tried the handle. It opened. The door was heavier than it looked, old wood, and it made this dry, groaning sound as it swung inward. Behind it was not an apartment at all. There was a narrow set of dusty wooden stairs curving upward into the dark, and I realized those were the stairs I had been seeing from inside my apartment all along. It was daytime, and curiosity got the better of me, so I went up. At the top was this huge unfinished attic. Big wooden beams, round windows like something from an old townhouse. Enough light coming in that I could see everything clearly. The space was enormous. At the far end, there were wooden frames where rooms might have been built someday, but there were no walls, no furniture, nothing. Just dust, beams, and silence. It could have been an incredible apartment if someone had renovated it, but no one lived there, which meant the neighbor I'd been hearing every night did not live there either. I went back down pretty fast and told a few friends. They all made jokes, of course. Everyone's brave when the haunted attic isn't above their own head. But the sounds kept happening. Evenings, late nights, footsteps, shifting, little crashes here and there. Then one night, I had friends over, and they heard it too. The moment they did, the jokes dried up. They grabbed flashlights and went upstairs, determined to solve it. They found exactly what I'd found, an empty attic. But they did notice something strange. My kitchen light was bleeding up through small cracks in my ceiling, cracks I had never noticed from below. In the dim attic, though, they were obvious. That meant the space above me was closer, thinner, more connected than I wanted it to be. After that, being alone there felt different. So I got a dog. I thought a puppy would calm me down, give me company, make the place feel less empty. And he did, in some ways. But he also made it harder to pretend nothing was happening. Whenever the noises started upstairs, he reacted. He'd race around the apartment, barking at the ceiling, ears up, completely locked onto whatever he heard. Sometimes I'd be watching TV and suddenly hear what sounded like someone running down those attic stairs. The attic door in the hall wouldn't open or close, but my dog would sprint to my front door, tail wagging, waiting to greet whoever he seemed absolutely sure was coming. That was somehow worse than fear. He was excited. Over time, the sounds got more frequent. At first it was only evenings. Then it was late nights. Then it was any hour it pleased. The final straw was New Year's. I had 3 people staying over, including my boyfriend. They all knew the stories. We had talked about the attic, laughed nervously, tried to explain things away. Eventually, we all went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up to noises above the hallway. Then there was banging from the bathroom. It sounded like someone was trying to close the door, but couldn't quite manage it. At first, I was annoyed because I thought one of my friends was messing around. My dog jumped up, eager to investigate, so I opened my bedroom door. But instead of going toward the bathroom, he bolted into the living room where my friends were sleeping. That made me stop. I went to the bathroom anyway, and I saw the door moving by itself. It slowly opened, then slammed shut. I pushed it open and checked the window. Closed. No draft, nothing hanging on the handle, nothing behind the door. No explanation. I called the dog and hurried back to my room, completely shaken. My bedroom door had 2 panels of frosted glass, and in my rush to shut it, I woke my boyfriend. I got back into bed, but the dog stayed near the door, whining and scratching like he wanted out. I was trying to call him back when my boyfriend suddenly said, "What the hell is that?" Through the frosted glass, we saw a bright light moving down the dark hallway. Not flashing, not flickering, moving. Slowly, like someone was walking past the bedroom door carrying a lantern or a flashlight. We froze. Neither of us opened that door. After the light passed toward the living room, the noises faded. Nobody slept after that, except the dog, who apparently had made peace with the impossible. That night changed things. My boyfriend and I moved a few steps faster in our relationship, because very soon after, I moved in with him. 2 of my friends who were there still bring it up sometimes, trying to make it make sense. Maybe the bathroom door was a draft, they say, but we all know how that door moved. It slowly opened, then slammed shut with force. Not once, repeatedly. And the light? People have suggested a car passing outside, but car headlights don't reach a 3rd-floor hallway through a kitchen window, around corners, through walls, and then move slowly past frosted bedroom glass like someone carrying them by hand. I still don't know what was in that place. I just know I'm glad I don't live under it anymore. I'm going through something very similar to what you're describing. My daughter is almost 4 now, but this started when she was about a year old. At first, it was little things. We would hear her through the baby monitor, just babbling away like she was having a full conversation with someone in the room. Then there were times I'd be changing her, and she'd look past my shoulder toward the doorway, completely focused on something. Of course, I'd turn around, and there would be nothing there. I remember looking back at her and quietly wondering, "Do you see someone?" Then, when she was around 2, we were playing in the living room together. Out of nowhere, she stopped, turned her head, and asked, "Where did Poppy go?" That hit me hard, because my dad passed away about 5 months before she was born. And the thing is, I didn't really talk about him. I didn't have pictures of him hanging around the house. Losing him had been really painful for me, so I kept a lot of that tucked away. But when she said that, it got my attention. A little while later, she said something about him leaving in an old car. That confused me because my dad mostly rode motorcycles and drove a pickup truck. So I thought, what is she talking about? But then she started describing these 2 older cars in surprising detail. Later, I asked my mother about it, and she confirmed that my parents had owned those exact cars before I was even born. They had sold them before I came along. There were no photos of them in our house. I had never heard stories about them, but my daughter was able to pick them out from a lineup of maybe 30 or 40 cars. The color, the make, the model, everything. It was honestly unsettling. After that, for several days, she would randomly point to a chair or a spot on the couch and say, "Poppy's there." And we'd look, and of course, there was nothing we could see. About a week later, we were at a hardware store. I was buying screws for a project, and I grabbed a cheaper box of drywall screws instead of the construction screws I actually needed. My daughter looked at me and said, "Those aren't the right screws." Same wording, same tone. Exactly the kind of thing my dad would have said. I looked at her and asked, "What did you just say?" She repeated it. So I asked, "How would you know that?" Without missing a beat, she said, "Poppy told me." I froze for a second, because at that point I was starting to feel genuinely shaken. So I said, "Well, if Poppy told you those are the wrong ones, did he tell you which ones are the right ones?" And again, without hesitation, she pointed to the correct box. So yes, I put the drywall screws back and bought the construction screws. And honestly, that was just the beginning. There have been other moments too. One time, she was at my mom's house, looking out into the backyard and talking like someone was there. I asked her who she was talking to, and she said, "That little boy out there." I looked outside. No one was there. So I asked her to describe him, and she gave me all these details. Clothes, hair, where he was standing, just very specific things that made me pause. And things like that kept happening. The strange part is, now I've started seeing things too, and that had never happened to me before. I took a trip to Idaho to visit an old family friend, and I stayed in his den, kind of a living room area. One night, I saw what looked like two shadowy figures sitting on the staircase. Then I saw a tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the laundry room. Later, I saw another silhouette leaning over the couch, almost like it was looking down at me while I was lying there. The next day, I said to my friend, "You might want to get this house cleansed, because I saw some strange stuff last night." That's when he started telling me about his daughter, who has apparently seen things like that since she was little. She's 16 now, so I sat down with her and asked if her parents had ever told her about my daughter talking to her poppy. I started explaining the story, and then I said, "It was weird, but not as weird as last night when I saw a really tall..." Before I could finish, she interrupted and said, "Broad-shouldered man in the laundry room?" I just stared at her. Then I said, "Yeah." "And there were two people." She cut in again and said, "Sitting on the stairs?" And I said, "Yes." Then she told me there was another one that sometimes appeared over the couch, and one in her room that sits behind the door. She explained that she sees things almost every day, but she doesn't interact with them. She doesn't try to figure out whether they're speaking or what they want. She just notices them, lets them be, and moves on. I'm not an especially religious person, and I don't expect everyone to believe me. I know how it sounds, but these things happen to me, and they felt very real. Even now, my daughter will still make random comments about things she sees or hears. I don't make a huge deal out of it. I just make sure she feels safe, and then I write it down in a little notebook I keep. That's really why I wanted to share this with you. My daughter seems to be experiencing something very similar, and the way I see it is this. If it isn't hurting her, and she seems happy and unafraid, then I'm going to keep watching, keep listening, and let her talk about it. But I really do recommend writing these moments down when they happen. Write as much detail as you can, even the little things that don't seem important at the time. Because whatever this is, it's fascinating what children seem able to notice. So, this all started one night when my girlfriend Lila and I smoked some weed that honestly felt different from the start. It came from this one dealer we had gotten from before, and there had been a couple of times where it made us feel strange, like we kept catching movement in the corner of our eyes. Little flashes, shapes, that kind of thing. But this time, it felt heavier, darker. I didn't even smoke that much, but it hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. We went home, did our usual routine, and eventually got into bed. It was around 3 in the morning when I must have zoned out, or maybe fallen asleep for a bit. I woke up to the sound of my own voice. I was chanting under my breath. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. I remember snapping awake and thinking, what am I doing? I was confused and scared because it didn't feel like something I had chosen to do. So I stopped myself. Then I looked over at Lila. She was sitting straight up in bed, completely still, staring right at me with this blank expression. She was chanting too, in that same strange language, in this low, eerie voice that didn't feel like hers. Her face looked wrong somehow, uncanny, and her eyes looked almost black. That was when I felt it, this incredibly dark presence in the room. I don't know how else to describe it. It felt evil in a way I had never felt before in my life. My whole body reacted before my mind even caught up, and I jumped out of bed screaming. Not just yelling, screaming like something out of a horror movie. I had never made a sound like that before. I woke up the whole house. Lila suddenly looked normal again, but she was terrified. Her parents came running in, asking what happened, and I couldn't explain it. Every time I tried to think about saying it out loud, I felt this pressure around my throat, like something was stopping me. I had to breathe slowly just to make it ease up. So I told them it was a nightmare. But I told Lila the truth, or as much as I could. I said, I can't talk about it. My body won't let me. The rest of that night was awful. Her face kept seeming like it was changing, almost morphing in tiny ways. She didn't feel real to me. Sometimes she didn't even feel like herself. A few times, when her face shifted in my mind, I had these sudden bursts of fear and anger, like I was terrified I might lose control or hurt her. That scared me more than anything. She broke down crying. She was scared for me, and honestly, I was scared of myself. We ended up lying on the couch, but I didn't sleep at all. Since then, I've had trouble sleeping. I usually stay awake until the sun comes up before I can relax enough to close my eyes. By morning, I felt a little more grounded, and I finally told her what I saw. Even then, talking about it gave me chills. I still felt that pressure in my throat. Even remembering it now makes my skin crawl. The next day, people's faces still seemed a little off to me. Not as intense, but enough that they felt fake sometimes. Even my own mother looked strange for a moment, and that really shook me. What scares me most is that I don't know what I was chanting. Part of me keeps worrying that maybe I said something I shouldn't have. Like maybe I gave something permission without realizing it. I know that sounds strange, but that's where my mind keeps going. I had sleep paralysis about a week before this happened too. And then, another night, a shoebox fell from the top of Lila's wardrobe right around midnight, which scared both of us. During the day, I mostly feel fine, but at night, the thoughts come back. The chills come back. That feeling comes back. Then, on Sunday around 1 in the afternoon, I woke up into sleep paralysis again. This time, I saw a dark figure hovering near my legs. He looked like a thin man, maybe around 5'9", lean, with tiny white dots where his eyes should have been. It wasn't as terrifying as the first experience, but it still felt wrong. And honestly, I just need it to stop. Before I answer, I just want to ask for a little clarity. When you talk about people refusing to acknowledge certain things, are you referring to me specifically? Or are you talking about your own experiences, or maybe a mindset you've noticed in other people? I'd answer a little differently depending on what you mean. But based on what you've shared, I'm going to respond as though you're speaking from your own experience. I've had paranormal experiences since I was about 6 years old. And honestly, it runs through my family in different ways. Some people accept it openly, some brush it off, and some act like it's nothing, even when you can tell deep down they know something happened. But whether someone believes in this stuff or not, sending harassment or death threats over it is never okay. That says far more about the person doing it than it does about anyone who is simply trying to talk openly about what they've experienced. And part of me thinks that kind of extreme reaction comes from fear. Not just ordinary fear either. More like the kind of fear people don't want to admit they have. Maybe they're terrified by the possibility that the world isn't as neat, simple, and explainable as they want it to be. I can't pretend I know exactly what's behind every strange thing people experience. A lot of it can be the mind playing tricks, stress, grief, shadows, bad lighting, camera glitches, sleep issues. All of that can create things that feel very real. But at the same time, I've had things happen in my life, and I've heard stories from people I trust that don't fit neatly into "your brain made it up." Some moments just sit there, quietly refusing to be explained away. So when people react with cruelty or rage, I usually see it as fear that hasn't been dealt with. Fear of the unknown. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing control over what they think reality is supposed to be. That still doesn't make it acceptable. I used to post some of my own experiences in online forums where people discussed paranormal stories, strange photos, odd videos, things like that. Not Reddit, just smaller communities where people were supposed to be comparing notes and having honest conversations. People would debate whether something was pareidolia, a camera issue, a reflection, an editing mistake, or maybe something genuinely unexplained. And that part was fine. I actually think questioning things is healthy. But whenever I shared something, the response was almost always hostile. Not curiosity, not, "let's look at this carefully," just instant dismissal. People calling me fake, saying I was lying, acting like I was stupid for even bringing it up. Then those same people would turn around and praise each other for stories or photos that were no more convincing than mine. It started to feel less like a community and more like a little club where only certain people were allowed to be taken seriously. I really don't know what happened to some parts of the paranormal community. There are still good people out there, people who genuinely want to understand what's going on, people who are willing to ask questions without tearing someone down. But there are also clout chasers, attention seekers, gatekeepers, and people who only believe something if it comes from their own circle. So if you're dealing with threats, harassment, or people trying to shame you for what you believe or what you've experienced, please remember this: those are not your people. Keep looking until you find spaces where people can question things without being cruel. It may take time, but it's worth finding a community that has both compassion and common sense. And I'll add this too. Don't just join groups that blindly validate every single thing you say. That's not healthy either. A good community should be able to say, "We believe you experienced something," while still being willing to ask, "What else could it have been?" That balance matters. As for me, I'm not a skeptic in the dismissive sense. I do believe there are things we don't fully understand. But I also try to rule out every practical explanation first because I care about being honest. If something can be explained by a normal cause, I want to know that. And if it can't, then I want to be just as honest about that too. I've had experiences that other people witnessed with me, things none of us could explain. Strange encounters, disturbing presences, moments that felt connected in ways that were far too specific to feel random. I've seen things that felt threatening. I've experienced things that felt almost inhuman, and I've had situations happen that still bother me when I think about them too long. One of the biggest wake-up calls happened after a shower. There was a handprint on the bathroom mirror. The mirror had steamed up everywhere except where this hand had been, like someone had pressed their palm against the glass before the steam formed around it. But the print itself was completely dry. It looked human at first, except the fingertips were stretched and pointed, almost like claws. I took a picture of it because I knew no one would believe me. And about a week later, that picture was gone from my phone. Not moved, not hidden, just gone. That's the kind of thing I can't easily explain, and I don't expect everyone to believe it. But I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. So when people talk about the paranormal, I try to leave room for both sides, the practical and the mysterious, because sometimes the truth is simple, and sometimes it knocks quietly from the other side of the mirror. I remember we made the board ourselves, just out of some scrap wood that was lying around. Nothing fancy, nothing polished, just a rough little Ouija board scratched together because we were bored, tired, and probably a little too curious for our own good. One of the guys on my team, Corporal Dreves, swore he had something following him. He called it his guardian angel, though the way he talked about it never felt quite that simple. He said he could speak to it through the board. A few of us didn't really believe him, but we wanted to see it for ourselves. We found this empty supply closet inside a bombed-out college building. There was a small cracked window near the top of the wall, and just enough moonlight came through to let us see the board. It was Dreves, Doc, Corporal Vale, and me. Dreves didn't do any ceremony. No candles, no chanting, nothing dramatic like in the movies. He just looked down at the board and called out to it. He called it Elias. And then the planchette started moving. None of us had our hands on it. That was the first thing that made the room feel different. Dreves said it was Elias. He said Elias could do strange things, including answering questions you only thought about. So of course, I tested it. There was a girl back home I had feelings for. Nobody knew about her. I had never mentioned her name. Not to Dreves, not to Doc, not to anyone there. I took my hands away completely and asked the question silently in my head. The planchette moved. Letter by letter, it gave me her initials. I just stared at it. That was the moment my doubt started to crack. We asked a few more questions after that, and eventually Vale got uncomfortable and left. The room had gotten darker by then, so I pulled out my Zippo and used it for light. There wasn't any wind in that closet. There couldn't have been. And then I had this stupid idea. I asked Dreves if I could try something. Not a real question exactly, more like a challenge. He said go ahead. So I held the lighter in my hand and thought, knock on the door. The planchette slid to no. I asked again, silently. No. That annoyed me. Or maybe I was trying to act braver than I felt. I started mocking Elias in my head, thinking it was weak, thinking it needed to prove it was real. Then I thought, blow out the flame. The planchette moved hard across the board, fast, angry almost. No. I pushed again in my mind. No. I was just about to insult it, not out loud, just in my thoughts, when I felt something behind me. It was like an ice-cold breath on the back of my neck. It moved down my shoulder, along my arm, straight toward my hand. And then the Zippo went out. Doc jumped up so fast he nearly knocked into the wall. He ran out of that closet and down the hall without saying a word. Dreves looked at me and asked what I had told it to do. I told him, his face changed. He warned me not to anger Elias again. I wish I could say that scared me enough to stop. It did scare me. It shook me badly. But it also pulled me in deeper. Fear and curiosity can make a dangerous little cocktail. After that, I wanted one of my own. I talked Dreves into showing me how. One night, when things were active outside and the whole place felt charged, we went up onto a rooftop and called something in. Something answered. I couldn't understand its name, not really. It felt too sharp or too tangled to say properly, so I shortened it and called it Zane. It accepted that. After that, every once in a while, I would still call on the original one, Elias, the one tied to Dreves, just to see if it would do that mind-reading trick again. But there weren't many people around who were willing to sit with a spirit board for long, especially after hearing what had happened. I still own a few boards. I use them from time to time. I don't pretend to understand what they are. Some people say they're tools for speaking to demons. Some say they're portals. Some say nothing good ever comes through them, and whatever answers is never what it claims to be. All I know is this. I wouldn't recommend playing with one unless you're ready for things to follow you, haunt you, or get worse than you expected. And I do think some people are more open to it than others. If you're looking for results, you'll probably get more from someone sensitive to energy, someone who has that strange doorway already half open in them. But one thing I'll say for sure, no matter how much they claim to know the future, I don't think any of them have the winning lottery numbers. Honestly, I've always been a bit skeptical about this kind of thing. I'm not someone who jumps straight to ghosts or spirits or anything like that. But there are a couple of things I've been through that I still think about because I was there. I saw it. And even now, I don't really know how to explain it. One night, I was at a friend's house. There were 4 of us there. Me and the guy who lived there were just sitting back, watching, because the other 2 had found out he had a Ouija board and kept asking him to bring it out. Eventually, he gave in. They set it up on the floor in the front room and lit a few candles around it. I turned the main light off, so the room had that dim, flickering glow. But the thing is, they weren't really taking it seriously. They were laughing, messing around, joking with each other while they got ready. Then they said this little prayer, something about protecting themselves while they played the game. After that, they asked if anyone was there. And almost straight after they asked, the light bulb from the ceiling socket dropped out and hit Toby on the shoulder. Then it rolled off him and landed on the rug beside him. We all just froze for a second and looked at each other. The timing was just too perfect. The bulb was out, obviously, and they decided to carry on anyway. Then, a little while later, the kitchen light came on by itself. Now there were 4 of us. 2 were sitting on the floor in the middle of the front room, and me and my friend were on the sofa. I was the closest one to the switches. There was one behind me by the door and another one in the kitchen. Nobody was near either of them. I got up and turned it off. Not long after that, they stopped playing. My friend put the bulb back in, but it had blown, probably from falling and hitting the floor. So he took one from the hallway and put that in instead, and it worked fine. Later on, we were just sitting there watching TV, trying to act normal, and the light came on again by itself. He turned it off. Then, later, while the light was actually on, it went off by itself. When we tried to turn it back on, it didn't work, so we assumed the bulb had blown again. But when he tested the same bulb in the hallway, it worked perfectly. The strange thing was, that ceiling socket stopped working for 2 days after that. Then it just started working normally again, like nothing had happened. Before that Ouija board came out, there had never been any problem with it. I know people can say it was coincidence, and maybe the bulb falling out was one. That was my first thought too. But then the kitchen light, the socket, the bulb working elsewhere, all of it happening after they'd been messing with that board. I remember sitting there with goosebumps. I used to want to try a Ouija board myself. After that night, I changed my mind completely. It taught me something. If you can't see it, don't mess with it. Respect it, because you really don't know what you're opening the door to. And it wasn't the only strange thing I've experienced. My childhood home was built in the 1870s, and there were always odd things going on there. Things would move. My sister used to talk to a little girl she said sat at the end of her bed. I heard noises all the time, but my mom always brushed it off and said it was probably a mouse. But I knew it wasn't a mouse. It wasn't just little scurrying noises. Sometimes it sounded like banging. Other times it was scratching, but not like claws. More like something heavy sliding across something. When I was little, maybe between 5 and 8 years old, I had this strange fear about knocking or banging sounds. If I knocked my bed twice, I had to knock 2 more times, because for some reason I believed that if I knocked 3 times, whatever was there would come and get me. I don't even know where that thought came from. I was just a kid. But I remember lying in bed with my fingers in my ears because I was so scared. I also used to have the same dream over and over. Wolves were running through the house, and I'd escape by jumping out of my bedroom window onto the flat roof below. Funny enough, wolves are my favorite animal now. As I got older, I sort of got used to the house. Things seemed to calm down, or maybe I just stopped reacting as much. Years later, when I told my mom about the things I remembered, she told me something I hadn't known before. One night, she thought my dad had come into the room and sat down on the edge of the bed. She felt the mattress dip. But my dad was still downstairs. And the same thing happened to him another time. He thought my mom had sat on the bed, but she was in the bath. Then, when I was 22, my parents went away on holiday and I was home alone. I was downstairs watching TV when I heard drawers upstairs opening and closing. 3 times. At first, I thought maybe my sister had come in without me hearing. I called out, but nobody answered. So I went upstairs to check. Nobody was there. I was definitely alone. I went back downstairs and called my girlfriend. I sat down and told her what had just happened. A few minutes later, there was this huge smashing sound, like someone had thrown a brick through a window. I jumped up and ran to check the kitchen, the back door, the bathroom windows, everything. Nothing was broken. Then I noticed something. Just before my parents went away, the front of the cutlery drawer had fallen off, so the cutlery tray was sitting on the kitchen counter. I thought about the sound I'd just heard, and it did sound a bit like cutlery crashing around. So I lifted the tray slightly and let it drop. It made the exact same sound. That was the most unsettled I'd felt in that house since I was a child. It didn't feel like a random noise. It felt like something was trying to get my attention. Like something was playing with me. I still don't claim to know what any of it was, but I know how it felt. And I know I never forgot it. I'm sharing this as my own experience, and honestly, no one has to believe me. I understand how it sounds. If someone told me the same thing years ago, I might have said, maybe your mind was just playing tricks on you. And maybe that is what some people will think. I can accept that. But what happened to me felt real. This was a long time ago, during a period when I was physically unwell. My body was struggling, but my mind was taking a hit too. I was exhausted, emotional, and worn down in a way I had never felt before. And during that time, I began to feel this presence around me. It didn't feel comforting. It felt like something was making me weaker. The best way I can describe it is that it seemed to feed off anything negative inside me. Trauma, heartbreak, sadness, anger, fear, all of it. And it did not just feel like it was feeding from those emotions. It felt like it was increasing them too, almost encouraging me to sink deeper into them. Then, something changed. I started working on my mindset. I stopped giving so much space to the fear and heaviness. I tried not to feed it with my attention. And after that, whatever I had been feeling seemed to fade away. Now, I know someone who does not believe in this kind of thing might say, "No, Clara, that was just your mind reacting to illness and stress." And I get that. I really do. Part of me would love for it to be that simple. But the experience stayed with me because it felt so present, so outside of me, and so deeply real. Since then, I've wondered about something else. There is someone close to me who seems to be affected more than I am. I have always tried to help her, especially because before all of this, there was no activity in the home. Nothing strange, nothing that made me question anything. But over time, I started wondering whether what is happening around her could be connected to her own anxiety or emotional pain. Maybe it is something like a poltergeist created by inner turmoil. Or maybe there is something around her that does not have good intentions. I do not say that lightly, and I do not claim to know for sure. I have not seen anything with my eyes, but I have heard sounds before. Sounds that felt like they could have come from something present in the room. I have trained myself not to panic when that happens. I tell myself, it could be a normal sound. It could be my brain misreading something. People hear things sometimes. And even if part of me wonders whether it is something else, I try not to react with fear. I do not want to give it energy. That has become important to me. Before, I could hear sounds that were neutral or even strange, and I was reassured by the thought that it did not mean I was crazy. It did not automatically mean there was something to be terrified of. Sometimes things happen, and we do not know what they are. The part I have not told her about is the coldness. There are times when I can sense cold air near her, almost in her direction. Many times, I have thought maybe a window was open, or there was a draft, or something in the house was not working properly. I would check for a natural cause, and there would be nothing. It is not dramatic like in horror movies. The whole room does not turn icy. You cannot see your breath. It is more subtle than that. A patch of coldness near her, around her, and then it is gone. I have not noticed that around anyone else. Sometimes, when I reach out to touch her, not because I am trying to test anything, but just to be affectionate or friendly, her skin feels cold compared to mine. And yes, that could be completely natural. People have different circulation. People get cold. I know that. But when it happens, I am never as cold as she is. Still, I keep telling myself not to jump to conclusions. I have had moments earlier in life where certain areas in a home felt wrong, like they did not want us there. I cannot explain it better than that. It was not the same kind of coldness, but I remember feeling that I knew something was off. And later, because of what happened afterward, I was glad I trusted that feeling. Right now, I am trying to stay balanced. I do not want to frighten her. I do not want to say, "You are so negative," because that could come out cruel, even if I meant it with concern. People are sensitive, especially when they are already hurting. I believe we are all good at our core, but I also think we can suffer deeply when we are not in balance. And sometimes, when someone is carrying anxiety, sadness, fear, or anger for too long, it can feel like something gathers around that. Whether that something is spiritual, emotional, psychological, or something I simply do not understand, I cannot say for certain. All I know is what I felt. And what I felt was real enough that I still think about it.